What's up, everybody? Patrick Connor here, and welcome back to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. History is on the menu. Not really modern history necessarily, but actual history discussions inspired by modern history. I'm here with my dude, Aris Pina, of course, CompuBox operator and fellow history guy. And we're here to talk about British heavyweights. What's up, Aris? How you doing, man?
What's going on, my friend?
Dude, it's going to be a fun episode because it's going to be a mixture of making fun, but also tribute, talking history. I mean, come on, there's nothing we could do about the making fun part. That's just kind of just a portion of what we do sometimes. But this weekend, right, there are British heavyweights clashing. And right now, I mean, I wouldn't say that necessarily the UK is experiencing a resurgence or anything like that of boxing. Boxing's always been popular in the UK, but there's kind of been waves of pretty good heavyweights in the last handful of years coming out of the UK. And it just so happens that Anthony Joshua and Daniel Dubois are facing off this weekend. So, like I've said many times before on this podcast, we get inspired by what's going on in current events. So, British heavyweights, let's talk.
Absolutely. I mean, it's going to be a good fight this weekend as well. Actually, for the UK, it's a massive fight, in fact. I mean, it's always big when you got two like extremely popular fighters from that area clashing in a battle like that. And then when you get a name like Joshua, who's one of the biggest names in the sports, like he's his own brand. He's up there with Canelo in terms of just being one of the most popular people. And then you have a guy like Dubois, who Daniel Dubois, he's had like he stumbled a little early on after like a lot of promise. And after he lost to who was it, Joe Joyce,
Mhm.
and looked really bad in another fight after he beat after he won that Fugazi WBA title. Remember he got dropped a couple of times. I forgot that guy he fought, but like he just didn't look good for a little while, you know what I mean? But
Yeah,
then to his
well,
credit, go ahead.
somewhat forgettable dude that he fought, Kevin Lorena. I mean, for now, anyway, it doesn't
Yeah.
mean that he won't go on to be somebody, but at the time, people are like, what the hell's going on?
Yeah, he got dropped in that fight, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so fast forward though, and like he has that really credible performance against Usyk, even though people are like, oh, he could beat him with a body shot, whatever. I mean, that was bullshit. But Usyk did what he eventually had to do and stopped him. I mean, he put on a really tough performance and improved himself in that. And he's had two very good performances since then, where he beat the hell out of Jarrell Miller, who listen. I mean, like Miller, he's like the butt of a lot of jokes for being like the PED king and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, man, he's still like a massive individual, whether enhanced or not. And that's like can take a lot of punishment. And that was a grueling fight that Du Bois had to go through some shit in, and eventually he broke through and like stopped him. And that was like a pretty impressive performance. And on top of that, his last fight when he fought Hergovich, he beat the shit out of that dude. You know what I mean? And like Hergovich was a guy like he held a decision kind of dubious over Zhang, but he's been like a guy near the top of the division for a while and like a guy that's deserved a title shot. And that was a very impressive win, and he beat him down for a stoppage in that one. So yeah, him and Joshua have bad blood, and should be really good for as long as it lasts.
Now, perhaps it wasn't super fair of me to open up saying we're going to make fun and we're going to talk shit,
Sure, yeah.
but it is true. But that being said, it's also I have to kind of give credit where it is due. I feel like I have in the past too, but nonetheless, not everybody's listening to like every podcast we've ever done, so they don't know.
Yeah.
Um, British boxing's a different animal, dude, as you and I both know. But in case anybody listening in or watching in doesn't really believe that or whatever, dude, the intensity of the fandom when it comes to boxing, I wouldn't say combat sports in general, but specifically boxing in the UK, it's something different, dude. When you're able to pack stadiums for stars and large stadiums regularly, and also not necessarily stars like on an international level, but stars who are like, local, hold some sort of local belt or regional belt or something like that. And fighters of that level are able to turn themselves into stars in the UK. That's not really something that we do in the US a whole lot. I mean, and not like that. And so that being said, I think that credit where it's due. the UK has really done its job, especially compared to, how many people are in the UK versus how many people are in the US, of producing stars, producing great fighters, and producing at the very least really interesting heavyweights. And we're going to get into that a lot today. But when it comes to this weekend, yeah, Daniel Dubois, or for the stupid ass Americans out there, Dubois, whoever.
It's
uh,
Dubois, right?
yeah, I think so. I don't
Okay.
know. I mean, it might be some stupid ass British people out there calling him Dubois too. But anyway, Daniel Dubois, like you said, I think you summed up really nicely. He has shown a lot of promise, and he's clearly a good puncher, very athletic, pretty fast. But his biggest drawback thus far has seemed to be that he gets tired quickly. He has stamina issues. And he doesn't seem to have the greatest chin overall. You can touch him, doesn't have great defense. You can reach him and you can hurt him, but he also might be able to outlast you if you don't finish him off. And so that makes him very much a wild card. And of course, this is some sort of title bout because it's stupid and complicated and always is. And there's belts branching off here and there. Make no mistake, Alexander Usyk is the heavyweight champion. I'm pretty sure everybody believes that. But there is some sort of title on the line here. But I think what's far more interesting is kind of what you were saying, what I was just alluding to, is this intra UK matchup between he and Anthony Joshua. Anthony Joshua is at a very weird place in his career. I mean, he's been at a fucking weird place in his career for like 10 years, bro. Is he's there's so little belief in the longevity that he might potentially have, and he's been around for a bit already, but he seems to have had a really inconsistent career, and especially his last few years, he always seems to be like a moment's notice away from some weird breakdown or outburst in the ring, either right
Absolutely.
before, right after a fight. So I don't really know what to expect from the guy. He's clearly a very good fighter, very talented, super powerful and strong, but just inconsistent and undependable. So those things, though, all of these things mixed together with Dubois and Joshua, that makes for a really interesting fight and a potentially explosive and fight that where we could get like weird shit, a breakdown, somebody going through the ropes,
Mhm.
a really bad knockout. So we could get all sorts of things. It could be interesting.
I don't see it going the distance. There's no way with those two guys.
I
Like
doubt it.
Joshua's not the type to go the distance. I mean, his power is undeniable, and like we said, Dubois doesn't have the best chin, and he can get tired on. But I expect to have major fireworks early on, where Joshua might get buzzed and potentially even dropped himself. Like it's gonna be good for as long as it lasts, and the atmosphere is gonna be incredible too. So I mean, it's already been said that it's at Wembley, right, and that they had to like
Yep.
add even worse because it's just the place is gonna be like bonkers sold out. It's massive, massive event out there. So good for all involved for that one. Should be one I'm working it tomorrow on Saturday, so I'll be looking forward to watching that. But like you said, this is why we're doing the show today because the UK has had a long history of boxing, especially in heavyweight division, considering they're the ones who kind of originated the sport, right? So when you really want to think about it. So you want to go all the way back to like the 1700s just for like a brief synopsis over here. Like when James Figg first kind of came on and basically was the first prominent person to like with boxing over there and make it into like an actual type of hobby, lobby sport, whatever you want to call it, along with him doing fencing and other things that were more popular at the time. Eventually, more people started getting, involved with it. Most notably, one of his students, Jack Broughton, because he was the first person to bring in rules, the Broughton rules, which is completely different than the rules that we know today. It was much more, just like back then, boxing wasn't really boxing. It was like a combination of like boxing, wrestling, street fighting, and I like closer to the early days of UFC, except even more or less refined, if that makes sense. But whatever, But think of it this way: through all those years, right? So you got Jack Broughton and James Figg from the 1700s, and then move over close to 100 years later now, and boxing is now a prominent sport in England. It's not really known in America like that because it still just hasn't really caught on like that anywhere else. It's known, but
Yeah, it wasn't
nothing.
until the well into the 1800s. Yeah.
Exactly. But in the early 1800s, you had a guy like Tom Cribb. And this is when like you have like almost like boxing's first super fight because Tom Molyneux, who we've talked about on the show, we talked about this whole situation, was a former black slave that was from America and gained his freedom from, fights and other things of that nature, then moved his way to the docks. I believe it was around New York, where he fought over there too, developed a very good reputation. Someone, a few people gave him an idea, like, yo, you can actually make money at this if you go to England, told him about the champions and everything. And before you know it, he was looking for a boat. And he gets over to England, and it was like the first major match between an Englishman and an American to fight for the actual championship, because at that time the heavyweight championship was always just like developed in England, just kind of stood there. So long story short, that's how it starts right there. And then after Crib, and it's still throughout the 1800s. Yeah, now the sport is becoming more popular in America and a few other places, but England's still like the holding ground of it all. And it wasn't until like the late 1800s, after like the prime of a guy like Jem Mace and who else was, I guess, like Tom Heenan. Was he American, or was he from England? Tom Sayers maybe, or something like that. I don't know. John C. Heenan and Tom Hayers.
Yeah, I
That's
was
the
like, wait a second. I think we're mixing
yeah,
up names. Like, hold on.
yeah,
Yeah, John Heenan he was from New York actually, but like yeah, like you like this that was right around when there was still kind of like a transition though, where there was like a lot of doubt as to whether or not American fighters could even what their it was almost like the pool like that they had the pool of talent was so small
yeah,
and in all of these other places it was just starting out like in Australia, in New Zealand, like
sure,
boxing was just starting out, but like thanks to Jem Mace who you were talking about, and in the US there was still kind of like they were considered like not good fighters overall, and also they were considered they had taken not to get into too much of a tangent because this is getting into like wrestling history and
of
like
course, yeah, yeah,
that's a
yeah, yeah.
whole that's kind of where it branches off. But similarly, like strong style wrestling, freestyle wrestling, those kinds of wrestling that were a little bit more rough were
Mm-hmm.
considered more American, like American style wrestling. And that was also at the time where boxing had not yet transitioned into like or like away from wrestling and throws and shit. And
Sure.
so that's how a lot of the American fighters were associated, was like they were the strong fighters who were rough, and the strong fighters who were like they wanted to get inside and rough dudes up and fucking throw and shit like that. Whereas in the UK they had started already kind of transitioning away from those styles a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I would say though, but like England's hold obviously on the sport as a general, because heavyweight division was its main thing. All the other divisions were still kind of in its infancy. Um, Kind of lost its footing when John O'Sullivan came on the scene because Sullivan was from America. And at that point, Sullivan had one of those things that yes, he stood in America, but like he was kind of like, I'll challenge anybody all over the world. And there were world challengers, like that guy Herb Slade, the Maori,
Yeah.
and a few others who came
Yeah,
over
he
and challenged
traveled
him.
with Jem Mace and shit and
Or most notably, Charlie Mitchell from England,
mhm.
who was the top contender on them. All of them got their asses kicked by Sullivan. So after that happened, the heavyweight championship kind of converted from where how it was like based in England over now to being to America.
Yeah, like Mace figures into the history of boxing like prominently. And
Yeah.
also, it's especially notable because he was born, in Norfolk, England. And so, he's also figures into this conversation about British heavyweights, but he figures into it because he's considered the last, like technically the last lineal bare knuckle heavyweight champion that in the mid 1860s, and that right around that time in like the kind of mid to like 1860s 1870s was when it started becoming like a number of Americans started becoming far more recognized. Tom Allen, Joe Goss, Patty Ryan, and then that's where John L. Sullivan comes in, and John L. Sullivan was considered the one to kind of like consolidate all of it and to
Sure.
be the link between the bare knuckle champions of previous bare knuckle champions, and then he was considered the American bare knuckle champion and then transitioned to the gloved era or whatever. But that's also, we've talked a lot of shit about John L. Sullivan too. So not to linger on like, Americans are better or anything like that. But that was also whether you want to agree with that or not, whether you want to be all fucking pro America or anything, unfortunately for many British boxing fans, John L. Sullivan was kind of like the beginning of, at least in the heavyweight division, the Americans beating the shit out of the British dudes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Charlie Mitchell tried it twice. The first time they fought at MSG, and Sullivan knocked him around the ring like he was nothing and knocked him out of the ring, I think, after 3 rounds, and that's when the cops stopped it. And then they had a rematch in England, I believe it was. And it was nasty, cold, raining in the middle of
Was
the
that
like
the one at the estate?
I think so, and like it ended up being a draw because it was just disgusting, and both of them had their feet stuck in it, and they're
I
bloody
think
and beat,
so. Yeah, yeah.
and they got thrown in jail afterwards too. But yeah, Mitchell lingered around after Sullivan, and he got a shot at James Corbett, got knocked down there, and like it just never really worked out. After that, you move on through history now. Like, let me see, because after him was um Fitzsimmons wasn't from America. He's from New Zealand. And, he had like lineage all over kind of like different parts of the country. So he was, more of like an international guy as opposed to being like strictly there. But after he loses to Jim Jeffries, then the title starts more or less being consolidated just in America because you get Jeffries, and then from there Marvin Hart becomes champion for a cup of coffee. Um Tommy Burns, to his credit, well, whatever you want to remember him as. Like his reign is a little funky because he defended against some of his buddies over and over and over, but he took the champs of like, the actual world title thing very seriously because he defended all over the world. In fact, Jack Johnson had to chase him for that. But and then, soon after that, Johnson becomes champion and so on and so forth. And it's after when Johnson becomes champion. The UK has kind of been out of the scene for a minute now when it comes to heavyweights, and at least people in being in contention for the championship. You know what I mean? There's been a couple of guys here and there they were hoping for, but no one was able to step up. All the guys that were top contenders, that were considered top contenders, were all based in America, and all of them. And America was so high strung on trying to find a guy to beat Jack Johnson, but they weren't thinking about the UK or any other part of the world to get someone over there to import. They were just trying to find any type of farmhand over there, like Al Palzer or Luther McCarty or Gunboat Smith, who I'm going to mention again in a minute, or all these other type of dudes, right? These are the guys they were just trying to build up. Hey man, you're 6'2", you look like you weigh this amount of punch. Can you punch something? Okay, you're strong. You want to fight? Make money? Yeah. You're gonna fight for the title. Okay. And then they drag them out there, and eventually those dudes like whatever, right? But eventually, there is one guy from the UK that starts making such a big name for himself that American fans, which back then news traveled a lot slower, but eventually it got over there, that everyone was getting really excited about. And so this is the first guy we'll bring up, and his name was, and actually the first name we'll bring up in the first bust we'll talk about, Bombardier Billy Wells.
Bombardier. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of this era, like right in the early 1900s. So just kind of to set this up just a teeny bit in the UK and how this all came about with Bombardier, Billy Wells, and all the nonsense surrounding British heavyweight champions. The National Sporting Club was founded in the late 1800s, and there was kind of like an aristocratic push in England for like I was kind of mentioning a minute ago, for boxing to kind of transition to, how would you say it, a more white collar type of event that would cater to, you could sell it in like opera houses, and it would cater to the upper class. You make a lot of money selling tickets and shit like that. And so, right around when this happened, well, I should say a few years after that happened, in the early 1900s, the British Boxing Board of Control, or what was kind of like the esoteric version of it, kind of sponsored, or whatever you would want to call it, a British heavyweight champion. And so that started with Jack Palmer in 1905, who was considered the first like true British heavyweight champion or whatever. And the guy after that who beat him was Gunnar Moir. William Hague, and who was defeated then by Bombardier Billy Wells. And so when Billy Wells captured the title in 1909, like you said, Jack Johnson, I mean, there's so many social things colliding here um, to make an interesting matchup and all of the things going into the heavyweight division at this time. Obviously, we're not going to get into all of the racial history of the US and all that type of shit, but that clearly figures into it when it comes to Jack Johnson. And the US was in the midst of trying to tackle this problem and get past it. Obviously, they didn't for many, many decades, but that was one of the first introductions to it, or the first major introduction to the US having to reckon with a major sporting figure being not white and them not being able to do shit about it, basically. And so Jack Johnson uh, had already started kind of mopping up all these other white heavyweights in the US, and he understood the score. He knew that there wasn't really much money in facing a lot of the other black heavyweights, some of whom he had already faced and beaten. Um, and on top of that, there was probably part of him that he didn't want to. You know, he didn't really want the tough fights either necessarily. And he probably got glimpses of these other white heavyweights, many of whom, at least if we're going by the film that we've seen, really sucked badly. And so, you know, there was a bit of a clamor to figure out what white heavyweight could beat this dude. And so, right around the time when he was expelled from the U.S. and they had the feds had manufactured charges of him transporting women between states. Essentially, this was a long, drawn out process where Jack Johnson was still stuck in the U.S. and couldn't really do anything about it. Had been arrested, but was bailed out and was kind of awaiting to see what was going to happen before he escaped through Canada to France. And when he went to when he escaped charges and went to Europe, basically one of the first things he was trying to do was make a fight and make a meaningful fight and to figure out how he could make some money. And by this time, that's where Bombardier Billy Wells comes in.
Sure. And Wells had that reputation. I mean, he had already lost once in England at that point, but like he was a part of that. Like, what was he? What part of the service was he in? Because he's the Bombardier. So what was that?
I guess that would be Air Force, but now I'm about how I'm and I don't even know how they fucking uh let me look. All right. He was the Royal Artillery as a gunner and then promoted to a bombardier. So I don't know what that is. I guess Air Force
I
or
mean, I don't
something.
know. It works well though with his nickname. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, well, and there was all sorts of, especially in the UK at the time, like a whole bunch of dudes had the unfortunate fucking distinction of having semen in front of their name.
Sure. Oh yeah, that too. Mhm. So he makes his U.S. debut after a number of fights. Like you said, he loses by stoppage to Gunnar Moyer, who was a guy that did lose to Tommy Burns. I forgot to mention that. But that would be like a sign of things to come though, because he becomes the Lonsdale heavyweight champion, which is kind of like the England's version of at that time. When he knocks out William Hogue. And from there in 1912, he makes his long anticipated American debut now. And it's at the old Madison Square Garden. And he fights a guy by the name of Al Palzer. And Al Palzer, which I think I mentioned his name before when I was name dropping random white heavyweights. Um, was one of those guys, the same thing. He was like a dude that kind of grew up on a farm, just really big and overgrown and extremely strong, but clumsy, couldn't box a lick or anything like that, but had a massive punch. And Wells got out, knocked out. You know what I mean? Like at first he came in there and he did what he did, which was like, yeah, I guess he was always a fast starter. He knocked down Palzer, looked like he was on his way to a spectacular win. Palzer got up and did what he did, was just outfight him. And what we came to find out about Wells afterwards is that like he could not take a punch. As like it was probably one of the worst people on the planet back then, who in terms of taking a punch. Like if you hit him and you missed, but the wind was hard enough, it might still stumble him. That's how bad he was.
Well, and I think that it was a big part of the equation with Billy Wells too was that he was like 6'3", 6'4", pretty well built. Like he was fairly muscular, pretty good looking guy. There's a bunch of photos, like there's a photo series of him modeling or whatever you want to call it for a have you ever seen like old movies or shows
Sure.
of like where how they used to learn medical shit back in like the fucking early 1900s, and there'd be like this lecture hall where motherfuckers are like stacked up, fucking like, like it's a concert or some shit. And he was like sitting there like fucking like modeling and fucking like, like, oh, this is the perfect model of a male human type of fucking
Yeah, yeah,
shit.
yeah, of
You know what I
course.
mean? And the point is that he was clearly made into some sort of British hero because he had captured their heavyweight championship. And I'm not talking shit on that, but my point is more just that it carried more weight at the
No.
time, except for as again as we would see, um being a big fish in a small pond does not necessarily, and it goes not just for British fighters, but for any in within the US and all that type of shit too. Being a big fish in a small pond does not necessarily translate to the bigger picture. Like it doesn't always. That's the
100%.
whole
Yeah,
point, is that you make steps up and then sometimes you get your fucking head cut off. And that's exactly what wound up happening. And that's unfortunately, like we keep saying, the precedent that was set, and that Billy Wells really carried on because he came to the US and was basically just getting knocked flat left, right, and center, but
yeah.
remained the British heavyweight champion.
And it's interesting too because like it really like cemented where he was in this place because people were thinking, okay, he's gonna fight Jack Johnson or he was ready for it, and here he is getting knocked out by Al Palzer and fucking Gunboat Smith. All right, Palzer and Gunboat Smith were both like well-known names in their time back then in that division, but they weren't known as the top guy. Well, Smith, I guess, won the White Hope Heavyweight Championship or whatever you fuck you want to call that back then at some point. But so he was, a little bit ahead of Palzer, but again, both of them were still like a little bit of a level below, let's say, like a Luther McCarty, who was considered the number consensus number one guy to fight Johnson before he had that freak accident that that he died, or Jess Willard, or say like Fred Fulton, right? No, Fulton might have came a little after that,
Yeah, he
but
was a couple years later.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, you know, type of those type of guys, and it's like,
Or fucking fireman Jim Flynn like
there you go, Jim
19
Flynn.
times. They're
Yeah,
just like,
yeah,
he's
yeah.
the best fighter to beat Johnson, despite the fact that he just got knocked out by him like 2 months ago. Like, fuck.
Exactly. So that's a better example. Fireman Jim Flynn, right? So he comes back to America, like I said, Gunboat Smith knocks him out. And you're gonna get knocked out by Gunboat Smith. I mean, that kind of cements you right there. You're not gonna do much with your career. And any other time he really like again though, he still remained like, British heavyweight champion. He would defend that, but eventually that started falling apart too. Georges Charpentier, who eventual soon to be light heavyweight champion, and about to break the $1 million gate with Jack Dempsey, definitely a lot smaller than like mound smaller than what he was with Billy Wells, but was still able to smash him to pieces the second time they fought in the first round. So it's like that was it for him. You know what I mean? He just kind of would get cooked whenever that would happen, and then eventually he would just kind of dissolve into obscurity. And unfortunately for British boxing, this was just a theme that kind of happened throughout the years for a long time.
Georges Carpentier. Here's a little, just I think you probably know this trivia, but not a whole lot of people know this. Georges Carpentier is one of the very few fighters that literally fought in every single
Yeah.
division in boxing, from flyweight to heavyweight, and
Yep.
competed too, which is pretty crazy. But he also figures into this conversation prominently because Georges Carpentier, in 1913, a couple months before he defeated Billy Wells, he defeated a dude named Packy Mahoney, who was sponsored by the National Sporting Club as their champion. And
Mhm.
basically, when he defeated Mahoney, he was considered the first European heavyweight champion. And on top of that, he was emerging as a French star. He was a very good looking dude, and also had a great personality, was very outgoing and everything. And he wasn't yet a war hero, not yet, because war hadn't started yet. But he, again, was a star. And so what wound up happening was basically, when Jack Johnson had come over, long story short, They had started trying to gun for a fight with Billy Wells because he was the British heavyweight champion. Big, good looking, slow, according to Jack Johnson, white dude that he could easily handle. And when they went to make the fight, they had, everything basically signed and ready to go. There was a big outcry from the public about having a black dude fight a white dude. And then that is exactly when the quote unquote color bar, you got to put the U in there in color, was instituted and carried on for several decades until I believe it was Dick Turpin was the very first black British champion and he was black middleweight champion. In any case, that's branching off too much. So Billy Wells, uh, because of this entire thing and because of the kerfuffle, because of the fact that they were not basically going to let him fight Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson instead went on this tour where he literally went around the British countryside and then into other countries where the only thing he would do was he would spar, shadow box, play instruments, and dance with his wife. Literally, no joke. And they would pay him to do that shit. But he
Mhm.
wanted to fight and he could make far more money fighting. So, on the other hand, Billy Wells went and faced Georges Carpentier because they were like, all right, well, then we need to figure out somebody for Billy Wells to fight. How about this little guy, this little dude coming up who's nice and popular. Let's put the British heavyweight champion against the European heavyweight champion, and Carpentier just mopped his ass up.
Twice. Again, levels to all of that. And Wells ended up being like one of those people too on the I don't know, I think it was like World Boxing, whatever it was, when they were like listing the biggest heavyweight bust in history, and he was and one the first one that they profiled.
I wouldn't. I mean, that doesn't really surprise me, and that's obviously a good shout considering how long ago it was, more than 100 years ago now. Because man, that's just like, especially considering how long he held the title, and basically he had several losses while holding the title, almost all to Americans or to somebody else, where like the title wasn't on the line, and he remained the British champion for like 10 years or something like that. But again, speaks to just the levels, the regionals versus international. And by the time, so let me just kind of look very quickly. He held the title from 1911 to 1919, meaning he saw three different American heavyweight champions. Okay, not quite because it was February in 1919, but he almost got into the reign of Jack Dempsey. So in any case, and those were also Jack Johnson and Jess Willard, two extremely inactive heavyweight champions in that specific span of time. So
You
at
imagine
least
if
he was
like
fighting.
imagine if they had a young Dempsey fight Billy Wells. I mean, because Dempsey did fight Gunboat Smith and a few
Look what
other
he
people.
did to Fred Fulton.
Yeah. Yeah, he knocked him out in like 14 seconds, right?
Yeah, dude, he just flattened it. And that was his friend. Fred Fulton was like, yeah, he's like, I liked Fred Fulton. He was a good friend of mine. He had to knock his ass out quick.
Fred Fulton was a good fighter. He had some good wins on his record, including a few over Sam Langford. I mean, the size difference was ridiculous in that fight,
And
but
he
like
was
still.
supposedly, yeah, favored in that fight too.
Yeah, well, I mean, Dempsey didn't play no games. But anyways, that just became like a reoccurring theme though for like British heavyweights for a while. Like they'd get hyped up, they come overseas, they come over to the pond, and well, things just want to end up as well for them. Um, but there was one dude, who did make a name for himself. He wasn't successful in the US, right? But I mean, like at the same time though, he was known for his heart and he's still old timers for many years until they eventually all kind of passed away. Always talked about him very fondly. You want to talk about a guy like, Tommy Farr. When Farr came over to the US in the so we're hopping over now by the 20s and stuff, right? Gotta whatever. But now, it's the beginning of Joe Lewis's title reign, right? Joe Lewis had just knocked out Jimmy Braddock and finally became champion after just years of being basically the number one contender and having that hiccup against Schmeling and then trying to figure out who was going to challenge Braddock after that. But they needed a good suitable first challenger for Lewis, and Farr came over from the UK, and not much was thought about him for that fight. In fact, no one thought he was even going to last the distance. You know what I mean? But like, to his credit, he not only did he take an absolute fucking pasting without going down, he gave Lewis a really fucking tough fight. Like he gave Lewis the business that fight. And not enough that people questioned if Lewis was going to lose or anything like that. It was never really like that. But at the same time, he marked Lewis up. He was there competitive with him, and he was landing up until the bell. And he gained a rep that like I said, he gained a reputation that night. Everyone like overseas over here in America was just like, "Yo, who the fuck is this guy?" Like, we want to see him again. And for that credit, Farr was able to come back here, a few times and ply his trade.
Yeah, Tommy Farr. I mean, and I'm not trying to talk shit at all, but it is representative though because it is one of those kind of stereotypes or jokes that they do make about British fighters now, true or not. You know, obviously it's not true every time, but the old like he gave it a go type of thing. And I get now it sounds like I'm talking shit, and I don't mean to, but I do think that Tommy Farr's effort against Joe Louis kind of does typify that a little bit in the sense that he did give it a go and he gave it a really really good one, and on top of that it's a bit unfair that that's what he's remembered for because he actually did have a very good career, and a lot of the losses that he picked up came after he took that pasting against Joe Louis. And
Sure.
even then, he kept a number of those fights really, really close. Um, he was a good fighter, a tough fighter. I'm pretty sure Welshman, right? Yeah, he's from Wales.
Yeah.
And yeah, and he held the British title. Gosh, now I'm gonna have to look for that. I don't think he held it all that long, really. But yes, he only held it for a short period of time in 1937, and he wound up relinquishing it. And I think that the issue was that he wound up relinquishing it to face Joe Louis because there was some issue where the British Boxing Board of Control was like, nah, you can't face him because of X, Y, or Z. I can't remember what it was. I remember writing it down somewhere, but for some reason they said you can't face him, and he was like, "Fuck that! Of course I'm going to face him because number one, it's Joe Louis. Number two, it's a shot at the heavyweight title. Number three, it's the money. What the fuck?" And he did wind up facing him, and basically, got his ass kicked and lost his and relinquished the British title in the meanwhile, but was still he kind of with that performance bought his way into
The US market.
contention with other fighters, basically.
1,000%. And if you look at his record too, before he fought Lewis, I mean, he beat Tommy Loughran, who was an all-time great, maybe top three greatest light heavyweights in history, or top five at least, right? Brilliant, brilliant boxer. He beat Max Baer before he had a chance to fight Joe Louis. He also beat Bob Olin, who was a former light heavyweight champion for a little while. So I mean, these are all like really good names that he was fighting against. And like you said, he already had a long career. So he was a decent contender for a first guy to get for to be chosen for your first title defense. There's worse guys you can pick. You know what I mean in terms of like recognition or like resumes or anything like that. And so he fought him, and yeah, like you said, Pat, he gave him a hell of a fight. And like one judge only gave him 1 round, right? Another judge gave him 5 rounds, and another judge gave him 6. So like 2 out of 3 cards were relatively close. And to run Lewis that close at the beginning of his title reign, when Lewis was at his absolute prime, really speaks volumes about how tough Farr was because no other contender was able to even touch Lewis close to that for a long time up until, like Billy Conn or some others. You know what I mean? Before then, Lewis was just on a rampage and destroying everything. And so after that, he fights Jimmy Braddock. And this was Braddock's last fight, I believe. And Braddock, put on, it was a really close fight. But I mean, Braddock had become a sentimental favorite at that point. They were going to, take the decision away from him. But like you said, the problem with Farr though is that even though he became popular and became a Madison Square Garden staple, a guy from the UK or whatever, is that he wasn't going to get like fair treatment in the US, and it started kind of showing in these fights. Like, he didn't get a fair shake in the Braddock fight. The Bear fight, in the rematch, they said he got knocked down or whatever. I've never seen it, but like Lou Nova, I've read about, and they said that he definitely got robbed in that fight. Well, not the Nova fight, excuse me, Red Berman. He got robbed against Red Berman, and he also lost to Lou Nova. So it's like, these are the type of fights over there that it was like he had a very unsuccessful, he never won a fight in America. But he was there for the entire time. He never got knocked out, and he made for really exciting, credible performances that people remembered. And when he went back to the UK, he still had a long career ahead of him until he ended up getting stopped at the end of it by another guy we'll probably end up talking about briefly later on, Don Cocken. But, you know, far exemplified like the toughness of like the English fighter or Welsh fighter, whatever you want to call it back then. Like them dudes were just tough as shit. He was tough as nails. He wasn't really the guy that got stopped, and he fought a who's who of everybody. And up until I think he was like living, I think he died around 1987 or so. He lived a nice long life, and he was fondly remembered. He was always interviewed, and he kept his nose in the game for a long time.
The I guess just to kind of give a quick anecdote about why, like why even so people might think like, okay, why would there be skepticism toward any like British fighters or whatever, right?
Mm.
And for a lot of the like people who are probably like your age, my age, and maybe a little older, because going much younger than us, people kind of forget. Like I remember hearing all throughout my childhood and through, attached to the history discussions that like, oh, the US bailed out England. The
Yeah.
US saved England's ass. That's obviously like not even true at all. But nonetheless, that's how we were told, right? That's how we heard it. And so, but just using your brain and going with the logic, like, well, then why would there be any sort of like anti-UK sentiment in boxing, like in the 1930s, even before that? Like, what the fuck does that, was that have to do anything? Just to kind of break that down briefly, going back about 10 years before that, when Fidel Labarba fought a dude named Elkie Clark in 1927, Elkie Clark was the British and European flyweight champion at the time. The dude who ran the National Sporting Club at that time was a guy named Peg Bettison. Peg Bettison stepped up because the New York State Athletic Commission was like, "Fuck that! We're not putting together this fight between Fidel Labarba and Elkie Clark. We don't know who the fuck Elkie Clark is. What does being the British champion mean anything to us? Who cares?" This dude, Peg Bettison, stepped up and was like, "Nope, I'm vouching for him. You need to make this fight." So they did. Fidel Labarba kicked his ass. Elkie Clark never fought again. And after that, newspaper dudes in New York were like, "These British fools suck. Don't ever do this again. Don't let these guys in." Literally. Like that sounds extreme and stupid, but that literally happened. And so it literally had to be that for a couple years after that, there were a few instances where British fighters were trying to fight in New York, and the commission was like, "Sure, we'll let you fight. Come into the gym on such and such date and go run this gauntlet of like 10 fighters, and we'll see how you fight." And that's literally how they tested people to see if they could fucking fight in New York. And it happened a couple other places too. Point is, that's why, at least partially why, there was this like anti-European and anti-UK sentiment in a couple of bigger cities in the US where they were like super skeptical of like these British fighters and shit like that. And that carried over too. Tommy Farr, I'm not going to say that he was like single-handedly busting these stereotypes or anything like that, but even now, when you mention Tommy Farr, that's the first thing people say is like, "Oh God, dude, what a fucking heroic, absolutely heroic performance against Lewis." And they're not wrong, but the point is that that's how that he took a beating, and that kind of anti sentiment then rubber banded. You know what I mean? From that performance from Tommy Farr with Lewis, where people are like, "Oh, maybe these British dudes are all right."
1,000%. And it was one of those things that back then, like far after his, like you said, his career long retired, he was always remembered for that type of thing. And then for a number of years, there was other contenders that were like still around. You had guys like Bruce Wardock, I believe that's how you say his name, like, right? Who
Gosh, I
was the
hope so, because otherwise it's Woodcock.
and he was a contender during the Lewis time. I mean, kind of closer to when Lewis's reign was getting ready to end. But he never got an official title fight, but he did hold some wins over guys from that time. Like, he fought the likes of Gus Lesnovich and he fought Lisa Wold and others around then. And I want to say light heavyweight champion at the time, Freddie Mills made a couple attempts to move to heavyweight. All those guys were kind of mixing and matching, you know what I mean? Like Joey Maxim by the time the Ezra Charles stuff started
Yeah, the
happening.
heavyweights were still just small enough that like
Exactly.
like you could be a light heavyweight and can and foreseeably move up.
Totally. So eventually, the next one though, I mean, unless I'm missing somebody here that was from England that ended up getting a title fight for the heavyweight championship would be Don Cockett, no?
Yep, Don Cockle, yeah. Yeah, and he also was the British heavyweight champion in the early 1950s. Um
Mhm.
And so, I mean, like, there's obviously a pretty strong correlation here. And that part of that goes back to what we were saying a couple minutes ago about the British scene just being a little bit more organized, a bit stronger, and also a little bit more tight knit. It is an island after all, England, isn't it? So it's limited as far as the pool of talent and how many events you could have, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that being said, there's a pretty strong correlation between the British champion then facing the American champion, as we've talked about numerous times on the show. In eras past, those things simply carried more weight. Being the European champion, being the British champion, even in some cases being like the Spanish champion or being the, some other
Well,
country that now to us you'd be like, so. And back then, it's in some cases
it
that
did. It
shit
helped
carried
you get
weight.
if not a title fight, like a bigger fight. You know what I mean? Definitely.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Or at the very least, then that was the stepping stone to you fighting the European champion and then, et cetera. So those things just carried more weight in other eras, and there's a strong correlation here. So by this time, though, in that kind of post Joe Louis scramble to fill the heavyweight throne, there were guys like Ezra Charles, obviously, and Jersey Joe Walcott, who were seen as very deserving and guys that Joe Louis probably should have fought a little bit earlier in his career but didn't because of the mob influence that was creeping into the heavyweight title, or not even so much creeping, pretty much just fucking kicked the door right over and right out in the open, to be honest. But I mean,
Came in there with their Tommy guns and their top hats. It was like, hey, how you doing?
not even like a fucking mask or nothing. Just like, all right, it's a robbery, see, and fucking basically, but in that post Lewis scramble and trading the title back and forth between Jersey Joe Walcott and Ezra Charles, and then Ezra Charles holding it for a chunk of time, and Jersey Joe Walcott becoming champion. I should say, not trading the title back and forth, but trading wins back and forth, and Jersey Joe Walcott eventually becoming the champion. And that was its own Cinderella story, but very short lived because he got simply brutalized by Rocky Marciano. It did a very good job in the early rounds, but man, Rocky Marciano, for all the nonsense anybody could ever talk about him, and for all the absolutely true, hilarious shit they said about him in Mighty Sharp, Coming to America, just in case anybody's like, I don't know what Mighty Sharp is. Come on, get with your
Barbershop.
fucking, yeah, come on, just get with your fucking movie trivia and pop culture references here. Despite the fact that they said totally true shit about him in that movie, you had to be real careful against Rocky Marciano if you were not a massive heavyweight who could just take him out because he would creep up on your ass and catch up to you. And that's exactly what happened against Jersey Joe Walcott. So then Mr. Unbeaten, undefeated, 49-0, 43 knockouts, was on his massive extended run. Oh, but similarly, like we were just talking about, British heavyweight champion meant that he would probably get a shot at the real heavyweight champion or the world heavyweight champion at some point, in which Don Cockle did. And
I mean, listen, Cockle was a former like middleweight, light heavyweight. Wasn't a big heavyweight, but I mean, none of those guys were back then. If you look at the average heavyweight from the 1950s, aside from Sonny Liston, who was a monster, or a cut like Nino Valdez, who would size well with a lot of guys today, those heavyweights were just minuscule. Like they wouldn't be heavyweights today. They'd either be cruiserweights or some of them would even be light heavyweights. And well, that's where Cockhill was initially. You know what I mean? And as he came up, he had a couple of really big wins over Lloyd Marshall. And at the same time, though, you have to wonder how much, on the up and up those wins could have been, especially the first round knockout. And then, but he was on his way until he fought Randy Turpin for the light heavyweight championship. I think the EBU title or whatever. And, Turpin showed his class and stopped him. No big deal. He just moves up from there. He's probably struggling away a little bit. So he moves up, and after a string of wins, including, what was it, 2 or 3 over Harry Kid Matthews, who was a long, long, long time contender, who had a ridiculous record of like, I don't know, one of those like Sugar Ray Robinson, Willie Pep type of records where it was like 80 something wins and only like one defeat at that time or something when he fought Marciano in an elimination fight to see who was going to fight Jersey Joe Walcott. And Marciano brutally knocked him out in 2 rounds, because when I say brutally, when you see Matthews, he goes down and his bottom of his head bounces off like the corner, which has actually killed fighters in the past, like Davey Moore, for example. But anyways, can't veering off track.
that's where Marciano lands the double hook, right? Like he does the
Yeah,
hook,
yeah.
like,
Oh, it was
yeah,
nasty.
nasty.
And like, yeah. nasty knockout. He stopped Tommy Farr and finished Farr's career, and he also scored a win over Roland Lastarza, which is a very which was a good win in itself because Lastarza was one of those guys who a longtime contender
Yeah, he was a
and
contender for several years.
gave Marciano absolute fits in their first fight to the point that a lot of people thought Lastarza deserved that decision. But so, when it comes to this 1955 and the heavyweight division is kind of meh at that point, anyways. The European champion, like you said, who has already beaten a few contenders from that time, well, probably is going to get a shot. So he did get a shot against Marciano. And like they said, man, he gave it a go, mate, but he got beat up. Like out of all the Marciano title challengers, aside from the rematch, aside from the Walcott rematch, Cockhill was the easiest one. Like Marciano was basically in control the whole time, just beat him up and eventually stopped him.
Well, and it's also notable too because that fight was the only West Coast appearance that Rocky Marciano ever made. Because
Oh, interesting.
Rocky Marciano is obviously a Brockton guy, but just an East Coast fighter. Fought most of his fights in either New York or Massachusetts, and I want to say he maybe fought in like Philly or something like that or Chicago. Yeah, Chicago. That was the Walcott rematch, but mostly he fought on the East Coast and he made his way out to San Francisco for the Don Cockle fight. And I mean, Don Cockle, he outweighed him by like a good 15, 20 pounds or something like that, but they weren't like good 15 or 20 pounds. It wasn't like a,
Cockle was pudgy. He was never like a fit dude. Yeah.
no, it was not like a solid 15 or 20 pounds. And he just wasn't really that kind of fighter to get it done against Marciano, unfortunately. Not a bad fighter either, but just not, he wasn't that guy.
No, and so at that point, like the UK heavyweight scene, well, at the turn since the turn of the century, it's just kind of been meh.
And,
There was
and
popular guys, but
sorry, the thing that I forgot to say also was that this was like Marciano, who had already been asked about retirement for like 2 years at this point, when it was like he like won the title and he was already talking about retiring like before he even fucking defended it. He was like, yeah, I don't know how long I'm going to stick around. So sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, when
oh,
he beat
it was just
Cockle, that was like Marciano like on the verge of going like, I don't really want to fight anymore.
that was just an awful era though of heavyweight boxing in general. I mean, it just really was. The IBC, Jim Norris, and like the mafia and mob, whatever, like were just entrenched in that sport. They had their hands in everything, and especially the heavyweight championship of the world. And if you watch like Marciano press conferences near the end of his career, like around for like the Archie Moore fight, for instance, the dude right next to him, right over Aya's side, almost there, like grabbing his arms like his wife, wrapping his arms around him is Jim Norris, the head of the IBC, the Playboy as he was called back then, who had all this money, was loved boxing, but was absolutely enamored with mobsters, especially guys who had bodies on them like Frankie Carbo, and so that's who. Not to say that Marciano was like willingly doing mob work or being involved with
Right.
everything. I mean, it's boxing. He knew what he was being. He knew who he was working with. He just did the fighting, and I don't think he was worried so much about the scheming and all the other shit. But like, that's just how the sport was back then. So I mean, the guys who were supposed to get shots, we're gonna get them. The ones who didn't play ball, we're gonna get excluded, and well, so on and so forth. But it wasn't for a few years though until like I guess. Did Patterson ever fight anybody from the UK for the championship? Well, besides Brian London.
Um, Trying to think. I don't think so.
Yeah. So London was a contender that came around in the late 50s, early 60s. But he was a tough fighter, you know what I mean? Most notably losing to Patterson and also losing to a young Cassius Clay in one of his early title fights. And also too, one of the things he did, which should be mentioned, is that he finished a career of Ignomar Johansson because Johansson was on the comeback after losing again to Patterson in their third fight, a wild series. And I want to say that it was the last round of their fight. Johansson was winning it, like by decision, anyways, and he was basically in control. And then London dropped him and like knocked him out essentially at the last round, right? But the bell saved Johansson, like had him out. And then the
Like,
bell
yeah,
saved,
he was like
yeah,
unconscious or something like that.
like he was out, and the bell saved him. And then, I think he woke up and realized, okay, you know what? I think I'm just done with the career. But he wasn't even the more popular guy of that era. What ended up happening around that same time, another heavyweight started developing and started making a name for himself, and he became, well, one of the most beloved fighters in like UK boxing history, let alone just the heavyweight division. That's Henry Cooper.
still easily one of the most beloved British fighters of all time. And I
Yeah.
mean, a character. A big problem was that Brian London, who first of all was the son of Jack London, not the writer, but
Mhm.
Jack London, who was previously during World War II the British heavyweight champion, and then Brian London was his son, also became the British heavyweight champion. But a big problem for him was that he was super inconsistent. He just could not he could not string together like several wins. You know, he'd like win 3 times, lose one, win 4 times, lose two, type of thing. And so the inconsistency was a big problem. And on top of that, a number of his losses were like bad losses. And
Yeah.
Henry Cooper also somewhat inconsistent at times, but pretty reliable in terms of his style. Pretty reliable. He was a really hard puncher. Um, and yeah, just a character, a funny guy, and I think easy to like. And so, yeah, even now, dude, Henry Cooper really fondly remembered by pretty much everybody.
1,000%. And I had a chance to meet him at the Hall of Fame one time when I think it was like the second year I was there. And fans flocked to him, you know what I mean? Like you said, very personable, very nice and all that. And one of the most popular fighters in the heavyweight division ever to win a world title. Like that dude, if you ever went to like England or anywhere when Cooper, I'm sure you can still find some old timers today. If you say a bad word about them, they'll ask you to step outside, you know? Let's go, mate. And but like um the thing about Cooper was that he always was, like you said, he might have been inconsistent, but he was always in entertaining fights. He had a monstrous left hook that if he was able to land it on you, chances are you were either going to go down or do a stanky leg or do something from it. It was going to affect you somehow. But his biggest gripe was that he had bad skin and like he cut ridiculously easy. And it wasn't just like little nicks or whatever it was. Like if he cut, he was going to get shredded. Kind of like in the same vein as, say, like Daniel Zaragoza or say like Vito Interfermo or um I'm sure I'm missing a couple other guys, but known bleeders like Chuck Wepner or anything like that. You kind of look at them and they start bleeding. And that was ended up being his detriment in a lot of fights and like fights he could have ended up winning or whatever it may be. Everyone remembers him obviously from the Muhammad Ali fights. Their first fight when um, Ali, then Cassius Clay came over to the UK for the first time, and it was a big event. It was a big fight. Cooper was like a massive hero over there, and when Cooper landed that left hook on Ali, who was basically in control before that, like being cautious but being in control. When he landed that hook, and when Ali went down like a fucking sack of rocks, just and lay there and his eyes were rolling around. He was out, right? Like he was looping out. Not to say, we've learned over the years the recuperative powers that Ali had. So if he got up, like, who's to say he wouldn't have found a way to survive it? But like at that moment in time, he was very lucky that the round ended when it did because like this wasn't when he got dropped by Sonny Banks, which he was hurting there, or like, other guys who ended up maybe knocking him down. Like he was knocked silly on that. And you saw his eyes just go everywhere. So Angelo Dundee over the years it's been discussed, did he actually cut the gloves, did he not, yes and now of course he probably did some kind of fucking shenanigans in there, but that only enhanced Cooper's legacy more than anything. Like he became a fucking god in that country just off of that.
And also the kind of flip side of that too is that British fans in the ecstasy of their fucking fandom have basically stretched the roughly 15 seconds or so that Muhammad Ali was bought with the glove fiasco into like 5 fucking minutes. They're like, Jesus Christ. Muhammad Ali got like 10 minutes, dude. He was fucking dead and they revived him and then he came back and he'd been injected with fucking like it's like they stretch it out each time when in reality it was like 15 seconds. And I
Sure.
think that what Angelo Dundee said was that according to him, Ali came back to the corner. He noticed how hurt Ali was, and that there was already a tear in Ali's glove from like 2 rounds earlier that you could even see on the fucking video, and that Dundee reached his finger into the tear and just started working on it and like yanking on it to like until it became like a more noticeable tear, and then called the fucking referee over and was like, he needs a new glove. Look at my guy. He needs a new glove. And fucking they brought new gloves over, but it only took like 15-20 seconds. It wasn't a massive delay. Did it help? Of course it fucking helped. No question. Ali was hurt like a motherfucker. But then
Mhm.
Henry Cooper's famously terrible thin skin caught up to him, and Ali absolutely tore his ass up. And I mean, those are some of the most gruesome, both of the fights are some of the
Yeah,
most gruesome boxing photos you could see, especially pre, like, not that color hadn't been invented, but,
sure, sure.
but like,
And you get the
before
sense when you look at it, like you see how nasty it is, and it's a fucking.
before color photos were widely disseminated, it's some of the most gruesome shit that you could see for sure.
Oh, and it was bad, man. Like, listen, Cooper was a good fighter, but there was a limit to him. Besides him having a massive left hook, he wasn't the fastest guy. Like you said, he shredded it pretty easily. And there was some home cooking to his fights too. All right. For instance, when he fought Zoro Foley the first time, Foley was one of those guys that we've discussed. Remember on the Forgotten 50s heavyweight show that we did. A dude that for years and years, it took him almost 15 years before he finally got a title shot, and that was ridiculous
And a
because he was
really good fighter too.
a very good fighter. But he was one of those guys that could be like lulled into sleep. You know what I mean? If you weren't really pushing on him, he wasn't going to really do too much to do it either.
Yeah.
And
Not
could
much killer
sometimes,
instinct, unfortunately.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And could make for boring fights because of that, or he could get out hustled sometimes. And the first time he fought Henry Cooper in England, by all accounts, Foley got robbed in that fight. Like he beat Cooper up. Like he was kind of his same self, but he was generally in control. He cut him up, and I think he dropped him near the end and somehow got a bum ass decision out of it. So when he went back for the rematch, he, well, uncharacteristically decided to just say fuck this and blew Cooper out in 2 rounds. Um, and then there'll be other guys too. Like he got stopped early on and by a young Ingmar Johansson, and Jack Bodell beat him. And there's let me see, what was the over here, and a few others. But there was a few guys that Cooper did have some big wins on himself too. Like for instance, here's a good name, for instance, right? Jose Yurtain. So for the fans out there who don't know who Jose Yurtain is, this was another major bust in the heavyweight division, but a different type. All right, Jose Yurtain was a guy that came from Spain and started making a name for himself in the late '60s, up in the mid to late
He's
'60s.
actually really popular. Yeah.
Yeah, he was very popular over there, and he was a guy that, like, again, like you talked about the good looking dudes, he was a good looking guy. He had, like,
Very muscular. Yeah.
muscular, very popular, and he was knocking the shit out of anyone that he was fighting over there. It seemed like he was just, a guy looked like a fucking Spanish Mike Tyson, right? Decades before Tyson was ever known. And so eventually people are getting curious about him and want to see him and want to know what was going to happen with him and yada yada yada. And there was a story actually by Teddy Brenner in Teddy Brenner's book. Not to veer off course really quick, but Teddy Brenner. Now he heard about Yurtain and heard about all the knockouts he did, so he wanted to go to Spain to check him out because he had an idea he wanted to bring him to MSG to match him up with Floyd Patterson, and so he went to Spain, and like they, Brenner was well known over there, so they held like a ceremony for him and like a dinner, and Brenner made a speech, and he was like, "Yo, I want to bring Yurtain to MSG. I want to match it with Floyd Patterson." They were just like, "Oh, we'd be honored that you would do that." Blah 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 blah. And then Brenner said the night of the fight, he went to the dressing room and he went to the Yurtain's opponent's dressing room because I guess he just wanted to make sure everything was on the up and up, right? And he knew Yurtain's opponent because I guess the guy was like a local dude from New York who had fought on some of Brenner's cards. And so he went up to him and he was like, "Yo, man, I just wanna," he was like, "I'm just checking in with you. How you feeling? Whatever." And he said the guy looked really scared and he was like, "What's up?" And dude was like, "Mr. Brenner, they want me to throw the fight." And he was like, "Huh?" He was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "They tell me they want me to go down 2 rounds, and if I don't do nothing, they'll take away my tickets and they won't pay me." He was like, "I don't know what to do." He was like really scared. And this is a kid alone in a different country, and he's kind of like stuck on this shit, right? And Brenner was like, "Here's what you do, man." He was like, "Fight your ass off tonight." He was like, "Do." He was like, "Don't go for this." He was like, "Fight. Don't think about it." He was like, "I'll do what I." He was like, "I'll take care of you." He's like, "I'll make sure they don't do anything to you." And he was like, and the guy was like, "I'm really glad you're here, Mr. Brenner. Thank you." And he was like, "Don't worry, just take care of yourself." Guy ended up going out there still taking a dive because he was freaked out, right? So that was right there. He knew, okay, this dude ain't what it was. And then so soon after that happened, he got matched up with Henry Cooper for the EBU heavyweight championship, and Cooper exposed him, just beat the shit out of him, stopped him easily, knocked him out, wasn't even competitive. And this was near the end of Cooper's career. This was
Yeah.
1970. Yeah. Cooper had been a pro since like the mid 1950s, so this wasn't even young Henry doing that.
Yeah, he was Ertain was this dude who followed in the footsteps of Paulino Euskudun from the
Yeah.
same region, the Basque region of Spain, and he did the same so basically similar to like Scottish strongman games, like we're like they're like picking up shit and throwing shit and chopping shit. They in Spain, in the Basque region of Spain, they do similar stuff, and one of the biggest things they do is this they consider it a sport and an art form called aizkolauritza, which is like the chopping. And so, like it's like speed chopping or precision wood chopping and shit like that. And there's also other stuff that they do, like lifting heavy stones and stuff like that. And Ertain was one of like the champions supposedly of these games, and so he was big and hulking and shit like that. And he was really popular. He had like a Beatles haircut for a bit,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
anyway, yeah, Henry Cooper whooped his ass real good, and that was the older version of Henry Cooper for sure. And that was so Henry Cooper. Another fact about Henry Cooper, not a lot of people know, is that he had a twin brother that got signed to the pros with him. It was gosh, now I can't even remember his name. Henry and shit.
Was it Joe?
Was
No,
that?
Joe? I don't know.
Oh shit, I can't remember his name now. Well, anyway, I have photos of them both, and they're but not a lot of people even knew that he was like an identical twin. You look and there's like two Henry Coopers and shit. It's pretty crazy. But
Oh, it's wait, Joe. No, let me see. Hold on.
No, 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 no.
George Cooper.
There you go. Yep, that's right. Because I believe that their dad's name was George.
Yeah.
And in any case, yeah, they one of the things that he did was he used to sell fruit on the street of London. He had like a fruit stall. That was one of the things that he did, like apart from boxing, especially around this time when he beat Ertine, because it was toward the end of his career and he's trying to transition away and shit like that. But the dude was a beast. You could not sleep on him, and on top of that, Ertine was probably kind of crappy. But I
Was
think that
Manny? Oh, I'm
what
sorry.
what's that?
I was gonna say that to finish your time. Not only did he suck, like afterwards they found out, he was probably a strong guy, but very limited. He had a really strange, tragic ending. So around like 1992, he was 49. He fell out of a window. That people say like they fell out accidentally. They don't know this either that or he might have killed himself or something foul play might have happened. No one really knows what happened, but
It's
fell
funny
out of
because I
a window.
posted a photo of him not long ago on the boxing history thing, and when I was looking up his history, I was like, "Oh, interesting potential episode." I mean, the problem is that finding sources and newspaper sources in other countries like that can sometimes be tough. But anyway, we can still look into it.
Yeah, but I thought that was interesting to say. But Cooper's career, after that, he fights, I guess, a guy we could talk about next was Joe Bugner because this is the transition period now into like the actual 70s. And this was, known as one of the most dubious decisions of that time period. Like it was fucking atrocious. By all accounts, Cooper beat him up and should have got the decision. Bugner was young, like super young. I think he turned pro what as a
Yeah, this
teenager.
was toward the beginning.
17.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So like he was still very, very young. But Cooper controlled him, his experience took over and everything like that. And referee Harry Gibbs, who had a long-standing career in British boxing as an official, had an unconscionable score of, I'm looking at it, what the hell does that say? 73 and a half to 73 and three-fourths, whatever the fuck that even means.
he gave him that razor thin one.
I don't even know how you score that. Like, I don't even know what that means or how you would score that by rounds or how you come to that type of score point or whatever. Maybe one of our UK fans can explain it better than can explain it in the comments because I have no idea. But regardless, it was such a bad decision. Cooper retired in disgust and refused to talk to Gibbs for a number of years afterwards until I think they eventually reconciled at one point. But
And he was, as far as I remember, he was cool with Bugner, and he didn't blame Bugner, and he was basically like, good luck, like, you're a good fighter, you're gonna make it, blah blah blah. But it was he understood pretty quickly. It was like they needed to pass the torch, and they thought Joe Bugner was that dude. He wasn't that dude, and so it's what happens when you invest money, and you got to, yeah. I'm not defending it, but yeah, it was according to pretty much everybody not the correct decision. But that was the end of Henry Cooper's career. And so one of the distinctions that Cooper has, obviously, besides being one of the greatest British fighters to never win a world title and a popular fighter and a beloved fighter, he's, as far as I know, unless something has happened in the last few years, the only British fighter to win the Lonsdale belt outright 3 different times. And what that means for especially American fans who are like, I don't know what the fuck that is. Understandable. And let me break it down for you very briefly. The Lonsdale belt was created by a dude named Lord Lonsdale, who's like, he had a longer title. I can't remember it off the top of my head, in the early 1900s, who was a sponsor of boxing in the UK and a sponsor of the National Sporting Club. So he got his, basically a belt named in his honor. And yes, that brand Lonsdale is named after that at this point. And so what they did was that if you win a British title, you win the Lonsdale belt. However, that's not your belt. You don't get to keep it. Like, if you win a world title belt and they give you a belt, like they're cheap as shit and total pieces of shit these days. They're worth like $250 or something, but it's your belt and you get to take it home, do with it whatever you want. But if you win the Lonsdale belt, that's not your belt. Like, it's like a belt that stays with the champion, whoever the champion is, unless you make 3 defenses of that title and then it's yours. So Henry Cooper did that 3 separate times and won a Lonsdale belt outright. That's what's called winning the belt outright 3 different times. And he's the only fighter to ever do that.
Yeah, it's fucking impressive. And that's his box rec photo too, is him posing with the Lonsdale belts all on top of each other, such as such.
They're beautiful belts. I'm not going to lie.
Oh, I've seen them in person because there's been a few people at the Hall of Fame that'll sell them at the collector show. Like nothing like major name, like not like a less like a Jim Driscoll or Henry Cooper or anything like that. But I mean, still, just to see them, just like seeing an old ring belt, for instance. Like I'm not talking about the current ones, but like ones that like kind of aged a little bit. Those things are gorgeous. Or I know your favorite, the one from South Africa. They're the old buck belt.
Oh man, I need one before I
Yeah.
die.
Those are gorgeous. They don't look like they'd be comfortable because like you see the fucking horns
Yeah,
of
they
them.
look
And
like you could
everything.
stab a motherfucker with them, dude. That
But
fucking
still,
antelope or whatever it is, that fucking, yeah, dude, the horns are killer.
well, it's still a cool ass shirt. I mean, cool up shirt. Belt. Uh,
You got shirts on the brain, bro.
always. So Bugner was another one of those guys. Like he was originally from Hungary, but he, moved over to the UK, I think, right? Like kind of relatively. He was based out of there. He didn't fight out of Hungary, obviously, and became a beloved fighter. Not close to the thing that Henry Cooper was. In fact, I think they kind of held it against him for getting that decision initially, but he was one of those fighters that he was, if not really exciting, he was consistent. All right. I think that might be the better word for it. He was a consistent guy and he was durable too. So him being durable, like he made for tough fights. And he's one of the few guys that aside from uh who was it? What's his name? Jerry Quarry, both fought Ali and Frazier, you know what I mean? And like went the distance with both of them. He went the distance with Frazier and like held him to a relatively close fight. I think that was after it was Frazier's first fight after losing to George Foreman. And he fought Ali twice. I think the first one might have been non-title, I think. And then was the first one non-title or was it? I don't know. But the second one was definitely for the title when it happened in Kuala Lumpur.
Yeah, yeah, Kuala Lumpur.
Kuala
Yeah,
Lumpur, yeah.
yeah, and like it's often one of the fights that's kind of, or both of them really are considered fights that are kind of like some of the forgotten fights or whatever,
Oh, as they should be. They're not fun to watch.
or the lesser known fights or whatever in all these repertoire for sure. And also a strange kind of portion of all these career where, unfortunately, man, there were a bunch of his fights that were just not watchable or not very entertaining. And I know that's like not popular to remember that way, but it's true.
Yeah.
But yeah,
But
yeah, that's, moving back to the British heavyweights, Henry Cooper is definitely prominent among them. And so moving forward, I mean, really, there weren't a whole ton of British heavyweights going in. Like the latter portion of the 70s and the
yeah,
early portion of the 80s was not considered a very good, like it's considered a very good local
yeah.
heavyweight division, a very good regional heavyweight division in the UK. Not many of them branched out successfully on the world scene.
No, no, like Bugner did his part, all right? Like he would come to America and like he never really won or had like major success over here, but he always like went the distance and would like hold these guys relatively tight. Like the Frazier fight was very close. The Ali fights weren't, but they weren't that very exciting either. But then by the closer end of the 70s, when he came over and like he fought Ron Lyle at Caesar's Palace, and that was a fight that a lot of people thought Lyle probably should have lost. And then he kind of went away for that, and then he resurfaces again in 1982 when this was like the first time he got stopped. He fights Ernie Shavers, and that was the undercard of Salvador Sanchez and somebody. But anyways, he that was on HBO too, which is kind of crazy to think about the early days of HBO. And you're watching that, and like Bugner still is young because, like we said, he turned pro when he was a teenager. So he's been around for so long. You think he's older, and he looks older because he didn't really look like a young guy.
Yeah,
And
he definitely
Shavers was
filled
all,
out too.
yeah, he pulled the fuck out by this time. And Shavers just did what Shavers did with anyone. You know what I mean? He came in there and he hit Bugner with his giant right hand. You see Bugner's eyes bug out like, Jesus Christ, I never got hit like that in my life. And then 2 rounds later, he looks like a roadside victim. But he still had he still fought relatively throughout the 80s. You know what I mean? Up until like fucking the late 90s. I remember reading about him when he was making a comeback. I was a fan in Ring Magazine. I was kind of like, wait, what? It's the guy that fought Ali. But like you said, it's true. The heavyweight division until the late 70s, there was Bugner, and then another name I'll mention really quick is like John L. Gardner. And Gardner was looked upon as being like a fringe contender for the world crown. He was definitely an exciting fighter. He had good power, but there was there was definitely a limit to where he was going to cross, and that soon showed when he came to America. Initially, he was one of the finalists to fight Muhammad Ali, and ended up being Ali's last fight. He was for a long time. He was the guy that everyone that it was going to be talked about. If you just Google it now, you'll see John L. Gardner and Muhammad Ali were supposed to fight for a number of like negotiations were happening. It was happening. It was supposed to fight in Egypt. They were supposed to fight here. They were supposed to fight there, wherever. And eventually, that fight ended up falling through, and then Ali, fought Berbick. But that was the basis of it. And then Gardner eventually comes to America and fights Michael Dokes. And well, to say the least, it doesn't end up well. That's one of the more vicious ass kickings you'll watch from the early 80s in the heavyweight division. You know, Gardner said it afterwards too that like he didn't realize how many levels above a guy like Dokes was to him, and it kind of like put his career in perspective because like I said, Gardner's a tough dude. All UK heavyweights usually are. They come with a lot of heart and everything like that. But Dokes, before the drugs took over, really took over his career. I mean, that guy was a phenomenal talent. The fastest hands you could see. He had really good power, the reflexes, and he beat the shit out of Gardner. And that knockout near the end, where he goes pop, 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 and comes with that hook, boom, and you see Gardner's mouthpiece just go flying like 15 rows back, and his head just snap, and he lays there unconscious. I mean, ugh.
Yeah, unfortunately, yet another British heavyweight champion that got mopped up by a dude in the U.S. or not even necessarily in the U.S. too, but another couple of guys who kind of got lost in the shuffle right around the same time were Jack Bodell, who was supposed to go on and do something, but then they brought over Jerry Corey, and Jerry Corey almost decapitated him in one round,
One round, right? Yeah.
and that was it. And that was, excuse me, and that was in England. And
Yeah.
then after that, Richard Dunn. Now that's
That's right.
a very abridged story because that was a couple years, well, depending on what you're talking about, a couple years before, a couple years after he fought Muhammad Ali in 1975, 76, and made nothing of that. Unfortunately, another one of those kind of like forgettable fights from Muhammad Ali. But just to also point out that even though we're kind of slagging Muhammad Ali with the lack of entertainment value and stuff like that, a lot of these shitty fights we're talking about, these were like the British heavyweight champion, the European heavyweight champion. These were like dudes who were considered like top fighters in these other regions. It's just that, they were nothing to an even fading Muhammad Ali, unfortunately. But yeah, that's a couple of dudes who got lost in that shuffle right there, who also, again, were taken out by Americans.
I mean,
Yikes,
Richard,
dude, we're being brutal.
I mean, we only could talk about what happened. You know what I mean? Listen, like Richard Dunn, considering some of the other Ali like opponents from that era, like that was Ali literally did a world tour, and like if he had a chance to fight somebody that wasn't going to prove that much of an effort, and he knew he could take an extended vacation an exotic place, he would do it. Like when he fought Rudy Lubbers in Indonesia, or like you said, fighting Richard Dunn, or when he went to Puerto Rico to fight the French dude, Koopman.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, the Dunn fight's not as actually kind of fun to watch because like Ali's not in shape. You know, like he's levels above Dunn. And he doesn't have to do much, but Dunn does give it a go, as they say, and like really does try. He's in there, he's throwing, and like he he's like taking it seriously enough that he's like, really making an effort to try to win. But I mean, like it's Muhammad Ali, he ain't gonna do shit with him. And Ali's just going through. And then when Ali finally was like, all right, like I think Dunn does hit him a couple of times, and Ali's like, okay, I'm over this shit, and pop, 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 and knocks him out. But yeah. But then that brings us now because it's now the late 70s going into the early 80s, and that Britain is still looking for like that one guy that they can like latch onto, and they haven't really been able to do that since Henry Cooper. Joe Bugner is still lingering on, but like we said, they never really like embraced him the way they did those other guys. And all of a sudden now, the emergence of Frank Bruno happens.
And that's actually really important too. That era is really important in British heavyweight history because the Windrush generation is not the only thing affecting this, but it definitely affects it in the sense that all of a sudden you see an influx of black fighters on the British scene, whereas before there weren't nearly as many black fighters representing especially heavyweights. So Bunny Johnson was the first black British heavyweight fighter, and he obviously set a precedent with that. And then on top of that, there were a number of other high level, or at least high level on that regional scene, black heavyweight fighters that led directly up to Frank Bruno. So, see, Frank Bruno never was the British heavyweight champion. That's a lot of things. That's something that a lot of people might not realize, or just didn't know.
Mhm.
But right around that same time, guys like Trevor Hugh Roy Curry, um, Horace Notice, Gary Mason, those were two, or I'm sorry, three very popular and well-known heavyweights around this time. However, Frank Bruno was considered the best to have the best promise. He was the biggest, the strongest, the hardest hitting. He threw the most fucking rabbit punches all of the time. Jesus, Frank, come on. But he had a lot of money behind him. He trained in a good gym in London. He was featured frequently. And that was really considered, Frank Bruno was considered kind of like the best British hope, featured on magazines and in magazines, as we both know. And he was definitely considered the best British hope on that scene for sure.
Sure. And when he makes his pro debut, and his pro debut was what, 1982? And
Yeah.
he's not fighting like, if you go through his record, I'm looking at a box rec right now. He's fighting guys that are experienced. You know what I mean? A lot of them don't have amazing records or anything like that, but they're not like pasties, right? Like back then, you can get away with guys having records like that because usually they were experienced and they can go to distance and they can do whatever it is. You know what I mean? But these aren't just like 0 and 12, 1 and 12, 1 and 10, 2 and 17, anything like that. Like, these are guys that 11 and 1, 22 and 25, 11 and 7, 14 and 4, 18 and 7. Like these are guys who are experienced and probably should go rounds you. And Bruno was blowing them out. And not only that, too, like you said, he's getting a lot of attention because he's fighting in like a Wembley arena, which we're talking about this weekend right now. You know what I mean? He's fighting a lot of fights over there. Royal Albert Hall. Like these aren't just like little pub joints. He's fighting legit places and getting pushed with a lot of backing. I think Mickey Duff was his main backer back then.
Yeah.
So
Venues with a lot of British fight history behind them. And yeah.
totally. He only had one fight. I'm looking over here randomly in Chicago, and I want to see what card that was because that was just a one off against a future Mike Tyson opponent. And oh, well, makes sense. Cedric first off promoted it. And when I'm because Cedric was based out of Chicago when he first started his career, so that makes sense. And it looks like it was just a whole UK card because Frank Bruno's on it, Lloyd Honeyghan, Barry McGuigan. All right, so that makes sense.
Huh.
But yeah,
That would
interesting.
have been yeah, Gary Jones would have been kind of fun, and kind of a fun introduction to a bunch of British fighters for the Chicago crowd.
Yeah, yeah, I dig it. So, all right, let me go back really quick. But it wasn't until around this time, soon after that excursion to the US, that he, starts fighting like actually well-known names. Before that, he fought Scott Ledoux, finished his career, knocked him unconsciously bad. Then he fights Bill Sharkey in 1983. Bill Sharkey, our old friend that we did the crime show on a couple of years ago.
That's right.
And I feel bad for Bill, bro. Bill shouldn't have been in that fight. Bill Sharkey is one of those guys you gotta love him because we know he's tough as nails. He came up in a tough way.
He probably
Um,
got brought over
well,
48 hours ahead of time. You know what I'm saying? Like
say
for
what?
real. Not
Yeah,
even kidding.
and he was really undersized. He was not a heavyweight. He just wasn't a heavyweight. He wasn't a big guy. And like that was the majority of why he lost a lot, is because anytime he had to fight one of these behemoths, he would just get over, he would just get overpowered. Like how he lost to Kali no Kanutsa and how he lost to, a bunch of others. He was just too small. He was basically a cruiserweight. But he fights Bruno, and Bruno's bigger than all those guys we just mentioned and stronger than them. So what do you think happened? He swatted him like a fly and knocked him out in the first round. Um,
Lloyd
but
Jumbo Cummings.
that's the fight that I got to talk about really quick though, because that's the first time that we saw Bruno in the chinks in his armor that would eventually become like his undoing later on in his career. So fans of the show obviously know who Jumbo Cummings is, right? A guy that has its own crazy story in itself. And the one fighter who might have been able to outpose Bruno when it came to a pose down, because Cummings was
That fool was massive.
and just shredded, bro. Like that guy, absolutely shredded. He was in,
Respectfully, he was like prison massive. You know what I'm saying?
and
Like
he always said that's how he developed his body. Yeah. Like that's literally how he developed his body, is because he was already big when he went in the joint. And he said that he put his mind toward it. He just wanted to work out. And so he just benched into this and that and that. And before you knew it,
and
like
he looked that way.
he was so much into it that he was at one point looking to try to join like the Olympic team for powerlifting or something. And I think he realized he was kind of like levels of below like what those guys were doing. But still, this is the guy that was built like an Adonis. And when he talked about his name, because they were like, how'd you get the name Jumbo? And he was like, listen, man, there's worse names that you can get out there. They call me Jumbo because I was big, not because of X, Y, and Z. He was like, I used to rock around with a couple of partners that were called Killer and Death. He was like, I don't think Jumbo sounds that bad.
He's like, I got the good nickname, yo.
Yeah. He was like, I think he was like, Jumbo doesn't sound that bad in comparison. But anyways, um, Jumbo Cummings at that point he was like a limited fighter because he was so big and massive. He was strong, but he was clumsy and whatever it was, right? And his biggest claim to fame at this point was pushing around, beating up Joe Frazier in a dubious draw to finish Joe Frazier's career, and biting Ronaldo Snipes in in their fight before Snipes eventually beat him. And both fights are on YouTube, but the Snipes one is nasty, man. Like they're in there and you see Snipes, I like back the fuck up, and he's like, "What the hell?"
It's
And
crazy how many times people have been bitten in a boxing ring. Like
yeah,
people automatically think like Tyson Holyfield, obviously, but like, dude, that shit has happened like dozens of times.
sure. And that fight was televised. I'm surprised the referee didn't like disqualify Cummings, but he didn't. He bit him. He bit Snipes backs away. You see the teeth marks right there. And Freddie Pacheco was on the announcing. He starts freaking out. He was like, he's gonna need a tetanus shot after that. He bit him, and he break the skin. He's gonna need a tetanus shot. Those tetanus shots hurt. And he was like freaking out. But anyways, that was where it came to. So back to the fight. Bruno was in control in round one until the end of the round, and the bell rings, and they were both throwing punches. And Cummings gets there first, and I think it was that a right hand he landed?
I think so. I mean, he's right-handed, so I think so.
Yes, it was a big shot, and like it was like in between them throwing punches at the end of the round, you just hear boom, and Bruno's body just goes limp right there. He does a couple of stumbles. It reminded me slightly, but he was even more hurt. It reminded me of like, remember when Mayweather got hit by Maidana at the end of the round in their second fight? And you see Floyd, boom, and you see him do like those two steps, and then they quickly pull the fucking bench in front of him before he collapsed or whatever was
He
going to
played
happen.
that off about as well as he could have possibly played it off, like
Sure.
100%.
Who, Floyd?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what I mean. Like it was almost like it timed it perfectly, where he was like, "Oh, my shoe, my
Mm-hmm.
shoe." You know what I mean?
But he was lucky there was no more time in that round because Maidana, who knows what he could have had a chance to do to him.
Yeah.
In my opinion, Floyd would have suffered his first legit knockdown at least that point. But
Oh yeah, he was hurt for sure.
definitely. But that's how Bruno looked. Bruno gets hit, and he even more exaggerated, like he just goes, "Oh," like he's gone completely, like limp. And you see his trainers run into the ring, freak the fuck out because this has never happened. They just grab him. They're so much smaller than him, they almost fall under his power. There's like, because Bruno was dead weight right there,
Yeah,
and you
this was
hear it.
back when trainer that could still happen. Because now
Yeah,
it's like if somebody's getting dragged back to a corner, the fight's done. But back
absolutely.
then, it's like they could like drag him by the ankles and fucking like prop him up and shit.
And the fact that it was happening in Bruno's home turf, they were not going to stop that fucking fight. And I'm like, no, they're going to cause a riot. So he gets hit there, and you hear the announcers too. I wish I could do their accent the way they do it, but they're like, oh, Bruno's done. He's finished. Bruno's finished. Oh no! Like you know, they always say, oh no, when one of their boys get hurt.
Oh no, what calamity! Oh,
Yeah,
it's a disaster.
this is what we were afraid of.
That's the fucking the Julian Jackson fucking Harold Graham.
Oh no, this is what we were worried about.
Oh no, we were worried about this.
Yeah. Oh,
Meanwhile, he's just getting counted over while he's fucking dead
and you see
asleep.
the way he was breathing too, like really.
You're like labored, and Fool's just like one, two,
Sure,
no,
you can't get up, please.
get the
Like, bro, give him
doctor
oxygen, get him a
right
stretcher, get him
now.
a fucking hospital.
Jesus Christ.
But Bruno got really hurt in that. And again, if there was only a lot of like there was more time left, he would have got stopped. But to his credit, he, his corner probably put some fucking salts under his nose too or something. But like they definitely, you see them douse him with water, douse him. Bruno's there just, oh, he's blink, like he's gone. You know what I mean? This, like
Probably
any of
only
us.
recovered because he's in such good shape.
Oh, like how any of us are when we get our worlds rocking, we're just kind of like for like 2 seconds, same shit. But he got up, and to his credit, he ends up stopping Cummings later on. But I mean, like I said, that was the beginning of like how it started because soon after, only 3 fights later, he fights Bone Crusher Smith, and he can't get saved now. You know what I mean? Smith would go on to win a fucking WBA title later on in the 80s and stuff like that. But he's always been a limited guy. You know what I mean? Dude with not really good skills, very strong,
I think
massive.
WBA. I think you mean a Riyadh Seasons title.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I forgot about that. They own that shit now.
Basically,
And the ring. Ba-doom. So
yeah. We're going down a bad road.
yeah. Turning around right now. But like that was another fight too. I think Bruno was in control of it, and then he just unraveled near the end. He got hurt, but this time he got hurt in the middle of the round instead of near the end where he can get saved. And well, things happen.
Unfortunately, he's just one of those guys where when he got hurt too, like there was no composure. Like he was just like, like leaning all into the ropes, and his legs just went to jelly. And like I said, like he was able to recover against Jumbo Cummings, and he overall had a good recovery because he never really had a super great chin. He wasn't ever a super
Yeah.
durable fighter. But even so, there were times where he couldn't quite get there. And those that wound up becoming kind of his calling card for a while was that he just couldn't get over that hump.
And it was crazy, man, because like he was always competitive, if not winning those fights that he couldn't get over that hump. Look at the Tim Witherspoon fight. That's a great fight, first off. All right. There's so many stories. We could do a whole fucking podcast on that fight in general, just because of the
Tim
shenanigans.
Witherspoon's got an entire like, yeah, dude, a repertoire of like weird fucking.
I mean, I feel so bad for Witherspoon, bro, because I mean, think about it in this way, right? This man, Tim Witherspoon, was supposed to make over $1 million something for that fight, and he ended up making, I think, like a little over 100K. Don King skimmed him on over $900,000 for whatever. But I mean, it was a close fight. Um, he definitely, like, Witherspoon was hurt a number of times, and Bruno was putting on a fabulous performance, really stepping up. But again, he just unraveled near the end. He started getting tired. Witherspoon, who has been as a very underrated fighter in himself in terms of skill and all that, and just has a ridiculous overhand right. And once he starts churning it, well, Bruno fell apart and he got stopped. And again, he wins a few more times, and then he fights Mike Tyson at 89. And that's what I mean by when I say like he was competitive in almost all his fights. In the first Tyson fight, he was relatively for like the first round or so. You know what I mean? Like he rocked Tyson. And
Yeah, no, for
yeah, and he tried. Like it was, it was fun. And also too, you got to keep in mind this is 1989 Tyson, and Tyson's unraveling at this point, like in every which way. And his skill level too. I think he was out of the ring for a long time before this fight. He was wild, awkward, and becoming more of the Tyson we would start seeing as opposed to the one that we remembered in the 80s. But go ahead.
one of the covers, one of the magazine covers, the title of the magazine cover said something to the effect of did Frank Bruno show us a chink in Tyson's armor? Or did Frank Bruno show us Tyson can be beaten? Or something like that. But yeah, right after that fight, I remember, which is obviously like how you just said, it was a competitive for a round, which is kind of a backhanded compliment. But it's true. Like he did show, at least for a brief flash, he showed promise. Like, oh, okay. But after that,
I mean, to his credit, how many guys back then were even competitive for a round with Mike Tyson? You know what I mean?
yeah,
Bone
not
Crusher
many.
Smith, Bone Crusher Smith fought
It,
to survive the
and
entire.
yeah, I was gonna say, and did it without just clenching. Yeah,
Bone Crusher Smith fought to survive. Tony Tucker did a little bit better, but more or less kind of fought to survive. You know what I mean? And Bruno went out on a shield. Absolutely went out on a shield. He got the shit kicked out of him and got knocked out by him. But I mean, he wobbled Tyson early on and he fought with him and he was like, brave about it. It wasn't like, I ain't gonna be no bitch. And then again, like he's still popular and he took a year or two off. He wasn't the most active guy by that point, but like popular enough that like all he needs is a few wins and he was gonna go back. And then after beating guys like, well, names that you would need to be to get to be back in contention, Jose Ribalta, Pierre Kotzer, Carl Williams, he gets a massive fight with Lennox Lewis. Um, I don't, you and I guess we can't say we weren't like fans back then to know the type of atmosphere if it would be able to compare to this weekend.
yeah, I didn't know.
I wouldn't know that, but I don't. Well, I guess if you want to compare it to Joshua would be Bruno in terms of popularity, and Lewis would be Dubois, right? And maybe Dubois is more popular than Lewis because Lewis wasn't that popular back then as a heavyweight, especially as a UK heavyweight. Got to remember, even though he was he was born in England, right? Or was he born in Jamaica?
I
Lewis, I don't
know.
know.
I'm pretty sure he was born in England, but he's Jamaican. Like
Yeah,
his like ethnically, he's Jamaican,
yeah.
and then he's
But
born in England.
how did
But
he
that,
get? How did he end up in Canada?
if I'm not mistaken, he had said that his parents had moved to Canada and he had moved with them for school or something like that. And so
Okay, that makes sense.
something about that made like that he could, try out for the Canadian team. And so he did that and then made the Canadian team. And we were talking about this earlier. He's treated like shit by US media, treated like shit by British media overall. Of course, they were outliers who were not idiots and who were recognizing that he was a good fighter and that, who gives a fuck about what he represented in the Olympics? Who gives a shit? But yeah, like as far as I remember, and I might be missing some small portions in there, but yes, I think you're probably correct in that, like, he'd probably be Dubois, and Frank Bruno is Anthony Joshua has often been compared to Frank Bruno in a number of different ways.
Yes. And so when he fights Lennox Lewis in October of '93, this is outdoors in Cardiff Stadium. I don't know who decided it would be a good idea to hold a fucking outdoor fight out there in that time period in October because it's always just wet and cold in general. And it certainly wasn't didn't
And it's
change
on the
that.
coast too, so it's like that's like
And it
awful
was
weather in the UK.
and it was freezing, absolutely freezing for that fight. Like you see the blankets out there. I think there was at one point they were thinking they might have to like postpone it because of the fucking storm and everything. And it was a nasty, nasty night. But Bruno put on again one of the best performances of his career. And this is another one. How he almost didn't come over the hump because he was winning that fight, man. Lennox, this wasn't the Lennox that got with Emmanuel Stewart. He was still, kind of in between things and all that. So he was most vulnerable. And Bruno, who he's always been like people like, oh, he's just a big stiff. Nah, Bruno could box. All right. He wasn't the most like quickest guy or like fluidity and stuff like that, but he could box. He did have a good amateur career. He knew how to fight. Like he had a really good jab. He knew how to put combinations together clearly, and he was beating Lewis's ass for a few rounds. Like Lewis was catching the business. Plus, it was cold out, and Lewis was like struggling, acclimating and all that. But eventually, all it took was one big shot, and Bruno just, and that's how it was. It was always like that until he finally turned the trick against Oliver McCall. You know what I mean? And we've discussed that and subsequently what happened with Mike Tyson again. But like, yeah,
And also that's yet another case of Oliver McCall beating Lennox Lewis's ass. So I
yeah,
mean, that's yet another, sorry guys. But I mean, and of course, the quick answer to that is, yeah, well, look what Lennox did to him in the rematch, or look at how long Oliver McCall lasted. Not, yeah, he beat his ass in the rematch, and not long. But that being said, it still kind of counts. Lennox Lewis and the whole story figures in here, where Lennox Lewis, if you look at his earlier fights earlier in his career, really gangly guy, uncoordinated, not very good balance. He would often just throw and miss, and then he's like on the other side of the ring because he just stumbles, from his miss. And that's like common from his earlier fights. And it really seemed to be Emmanuel Stewart who taught him balance, taught him how to fight a little bit more flat-footed or a little bit more with, both his feet in front underneath him and not just swinging wildly and shit. However, before that, um, Emmanuel Stewart was actually working with Oliver McCall, and when Oliver McCall wound up catching up to Lennox Lewis and taking that WBC title, then Frank Bruno got another shot uh, at Oliver McCall this time after rattling off a few wins over guys who were at the time not very good, but probably ranked by the WBC somewhere. You know what I mean? Enough ranked so that he could shoot his way up and get another shot at Mike Tyson.
You know that
Or I'm
that
sorry, Oliver McCall, not Mike Tyson.
That Oliver McCall post-fight interview from the first Lennox Lewis fight is one of the funniest things I've ever watched. Like he's all excited, he's animated. Don King's in there, the rest of the fucking like King cronies are all around him, and they're screaming and yelling at him. And Larry Merchant's trying to. He was like, do you think that Lennox could have continued?" He was like, "Hey, what you want me to do? Kill the man? He was out." He was like, "He would have got his ass knocked out again." He's like, "That's what's wrong with this company. That's what's wrong with this sport. You just want me to go out there killing people." And then like just yell at shit like
He
that.
wasn't that badly hurt,
Of
Oliver.
course he
Come on.
wasn't. It was just McCall was just going over the top. But then the best part of it was the absolute best part. He goes, "I just want to say one thing." He was like, "I'm a Showtime fighter." He was like, "I drew the first blood. I came over to HBO, and he was like, I took out your champion. Now if you want to see me, I'm taking my talents back to Showtime, baby." And no one back then, no one would ever bring up rival network. That was like you going on WWF and talking about WCW. You know what I mean? Like no one was bringing up a rival network out there. And so when they cut back to Jim Lampley with who was he doing it with? I think he was with Gil Clancy that night, right? And you see them together, and you see when you see Lampley, and he looks like kind of awkward, and what he's supposed to say, and he goes, "Well, there's a little sneak peek into the back discussions of boxing or whatever it is." Oliver McCall saying he's probably going to be fighting on a different network next time, and then he moves it on. But Lennox is one of those guys that like he's if he didn't beat Riddick Bowe in the '88 Olympics, I don't know how his career would have panned out like the way it did. Like I'm sure he still would have turned pro, but it would have, I think, taken him longer to reach what he did because him being a gold medalist and knocking out Bowe, who was like a big star in the U.S. Olympian in the finals and winning a gold medalist, I think was the one that like really, turned a leaf for him to get attention. Otherwise, he probably would have, toiled on the scene in the UK and Canada, whatever it may have been, for a long time before he eventually would have came over here. But that being said, that didn't happen. He turned pro soon after about a year after the Olympics ended, and it's about who's who until he starts going against guys like names that you would recognize, others that beaten around that time. Guys like Dan Murphy, remember that white heavyweight that was kind of
Mhm.
tall, gorky, or Ozzy Ocasio.
Yeah, there are a number of those kind of like mid to late 80s kind of run over guys on his resume when you go down.
Sure. But there was also another British heavyweight around the time that was coming up the same time that he was, and those two are almost like head to head, and that was Gary Mason. And Gary Mason is an unfortunate guy that no one talks about today because he never really broke out into the next level, but he was a hell of a fighter who had a record of 35-0 when he and Lennox finally got together, and it was a big fight. Like today, that fight would definitely headline a big DAZN card or something like that, which was for the EBU title and the BBC title of basically whoever was going to be the head of Europe in the heavyweight division was going to fight this. And it was a big fight. Lennox is undefeated. Gary Mason is 35-0. And it was a nip and tuck fight. Lennox eventually stops him. So it was at that point when they're like, all right, now it's time to take him to America. And his first in his first fight in America, um, where was it, Tahoe? So that's Nevada, right?
Yeah,
Not Vegas, but it's
it's
like
state line, which is state
yeah.
line is it's literally right on the fucking border of California and Nevada.
And as you see in his early excursions in the US now that he came over here, he's fighting guys that like are also Rams, the same ones, like the dudes that were good names in the 80s, but just kind of lasted way too long, especially long in the tooth Mike Weaver, a guy who had just lingered ever since he lost his belt in 1982, had been on the cusp of like, you know, of the world contention, and but more or less just been like a stepping stone for a number of years, and that's what he was for Lennox Lewis. Tyrell Biggs, 84 Olympian, who actually beat Lewis in the Olympics in 84, but by that point, drugs and other things had made him, and also ran, so Lewis beat him. Levi Billups, and but you know, this all leads to Razor Ruddock.
Yeah, that was Halloween of 1992, Halloween evening, and there was there've been a handful of pretty cool shows done on Halloween, and this is one of them. And I don't remember the fight at the time, but I do remember the fight from a couple years after because I remember they used to include the knockout in a number of the kind of knockout compilations that they would put out. And I remember just being like really weirded out by the knockout because it's one of those knockouts where it's almost like a throwaway punch that catches him. And it just so happens that Ruddock puts his head in like a weird position. Like, first of all, he gets hurt in the first round and he goes down. And that's part of the problem. But then, so when he comes out for the second round, he's covering up. And when Lewis is in the middle of a combination, he throws kind of a throwaway jab to land a right hand. And Ruddock puts his head down into the jab. But when he does it, it like twists his fucking head like around like an owl. And just like he just goes down like fucking out. And I just remember watching that knockout and being like, that is the weirdest fucking knockout, dude. It's just like comes out of nowhere. And Ruddock, who'd already gone to war with Tyson and et cetera, it was like, oh, who's this guy that's knocking the shit out of him? Holy shit. But that was a big part of the thing. It was an eye-opening knockout. And on top of that, it put Lewis in the position to face whoever, there was a jockeying for position for the heavyweight title at this point, but for whoever was going to win this the upcoming showdown, or at this point it would have been what people thought would be the showdown because it wasn't signed yet between Riddick Bowe and Evander Holyfield. And so, that put him in position to fight whoever the winner was.
Yeah, and initially this fight wasn't even for the WBC title. It was just an eliminator
Yeah, yeah,
fight.
yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
mean.
And it's crazy too because I believe Ruddock was the favorite in the fight. Yeah, Lewis was undefeated and all that, but I mean Ruddock was the one with the higher profile fights against Mike Tyson, and that he went to first time getting
And they're
controversial
still
spot.
crowing about how it was a bad stoppage and how he really beat Mike's ass. And I mean that's not the
Exactly.
case, but that's what he's saying.
Sure. And I mean, like, no one had still forgotten about how he almost decapitated Michael Dokes. So I mean, like, obviously he had nasty power, and
And
people were just
Arthur
not
Mercanti
expecting that.
Jr., bro,
Yeah,
one of the
just,
worst.
I mean, not even one of the road. Just put him as the worst. And my lifetime, he probably is the worst referee I've ever seen. And I've seen some bad referees in my lifetime, but like Mercanti just sucked. He only just got a bunch of assignments because of his dad's name and both of them working together.
Yeah,
But
I never
that's
seen a
all.
referee talk to a dude with like a broken knee and be like, "Come on, champ, suck it up. You can suck up this
Yeah,
broken
yeah,
knee."
yeah. Just do it. Come out there and fight.
Holy shit. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead. He's
Okay.
so bad.
That was a big shocking thing. He did what he did to Ruddock that no one else was able to do to him at that time. You know what I mean, including Mike Tyson. And like you said, it was an exaggerated knockout. Ruddock was like throwing a hook or doing something, and the way he just whoosh, and went down badly. That was a statement piece, and so everyone's just like, "Holy shit!" Like who's Lennox Lewis? And at that point too, this was soon after that, or was it? Yeah, soon. I want to say, was it before or after? I want to say it had to have been after that. That Bo made that scene, taking the WBC belt and dropping it into the trash.
Yeah, because it was the eliminator. And
Yeah,
so then after that, Lewis became the number one contender and Bo
yeah,
was the whole, like looking around, making sure there's a whole bunch of cameras and that they're getting it, and then dropping it in
yeah.
the
It
trash.
drops a little
Like
trash.
just toss it if it's not a big, just fucking get rid of it. Don't make a big scene.
All that Rock Newman is doing too. You know what I mean? So Lewis becomes the WBC champ, and now the belts are all like split again after they were unified and everything was perfect for a little bit. And I'm sure that's how the sanctioning bodies wanted it anyways. You really think they wanted to be lumped in with the other guys of the WBA and IBF? Absolutely not. And so, like we said, he beats Tony Tucker, he beats Frank Bruno, he beats Phil Jackson. And none of these fights he's like overly impressive in, kind of like the same way he was when he knocked out, like he didn't have the same fire when he beat Razor Ruddock. Like he beat Tony Tucker, but he dropped him twice. He dropped him twice, and still, like Tucker kind of ran him a little close, and it wasn't that impressive. Frank Bruno was beating them until he ran out of gas and got caught. And then Phil Jackson was just a limited dude who had good power, but he wasn't never going to become champion or anything like that. And Lewis kind of meandered around in a boring fight until he eventually stopped him. It wasn't anything special. So yeah, like everyone was still like labeled. They knew he was. I think people knew that Lewis was, um, what's not fragile, but like what's that word I'm thinking of? Like they knew there was a chance that somebody could beat him, right? You know what I mean? Like he was vulnerable. That's the word. Like I think they found him to be vulnerable, but they just didn't know. They didn't think Oliver McCall was going to be the one to do it.
Yeah,
And
and this was already a handful of years after Oliver McCall had already kind of established himself as a like more of a sparring partner level guy
yeah,
than a championship level guy.
absolutely.
Respectfully, I had nothing against Oliver McCall, but he had already kind of dropped a number of decisions, and he had already, his claim to fame at this time was helping Mike Tyson get ready for a few fights in the late '80s and I think early '90s, and being a sparring partner there, and being like a Don King guy
Sure.
basically.
And it wasn't until, like we said, we've discussed this before on the show, when you got with Emmanuel Stewart, and then that's when things started like gradually changing. And it didn't happen overnight, but like there was a distinct change though when after the Ray Mercer fight, and then the two fights that he has after that, he still wasn't able to show his true potential again of like how good he could be, because the second McCall fight was an absolute fucking fiasco in itself. Bless you. And
Thank you.
if you watch that fight, aside from McCall and him having a nervous breakdown and all that stuff, which is just sad in itself, if you watch that fight, Lewis is out of shape in it too. Like he doesn't come in and he doesn't look that he looks a little soft on the sides.
He was
And
struggling to get like momentum. Like he couldn't
he
really
was.
land clean, even with McCall like not doing shit. McCall is even
And
just going,
yeah.
just slipping punches.
And in round one, before like round one, McCall actually fought. Like, and then like it was after that he started round two, he starts like, acting a little bit more. And then after that, he completely loses it. But round one, McCall actually tried to fight, and he was landing on Lewis, and Lewis was still looking kind of like, oh shit, like, having flashbacks of what he did to him before. So like McCall had a certain style to him that was just going to give Lewis issues regardless. And so that was that fight, right? And then he fights Henry Akinwande. And that was a fight that people were looking forward to, because Akinwande was looking good up until then, in the fights that he was featured in.
That fight is so unrepresentative of him as a fighter, too. That's what's so weird is if you watch damn near any other, at least before that, damn near
Yeah.
any other fight before, he wasn't like that. That's why I was like, what are you doing?
Yeah, like he was a little clinchy, but I don't know. And then like Lewis didn't really hit him with anything massive that'll make you freak the fuck out either. Like, I don't know. It was weird. And again, in that fight too, I think Lewis actually gets decked briefly. Like, I think he was kind of off balance, but like Akinwande hit him and Lewis went down, and I think they called it. I have to look back on it. I don't really want to watch the fight, but poor Mills Lane, he had to be the referee for both of those fights. And it's almost comical watching him because he's so tiny, trying to get between McCall and Lewis.
Ah, now cut the shit. Knock it off.
Yeah, like he's really elbowing, and you see him struggling, and he's like comes up to their waist, and he's just there moving his arms, like what the fuck. But it wasn't until the Galata fight that I would say that we saw the same type of destructiveness. Um, that it was the same type of destructiveness that we saw previously with Ruddock, right? But here's the difference with this one, though. It was like not just how he did with Ruddock, and he was kind of looking on gangly, and he just landed an awkward punch while Ruddock was throwing an awkward punch. Like this Lewis looked fucking good. Like he came out there, that jab looked crisp, and everything looked good. His footwork looked good and everything. And I mean, it certainly helped him that Galata was on another planet mentally that night. But Lewis looked fucking good that night. Like the way he just pounded him and everything, I was like, holy shit. I think that stood everybody up, that they were just kind of like, whoa. And yeah, from there, that was the Lewis that we got accustomed to, that we would see more or less for the rest of his career.
We saw on a number of different occasions that like when Lennox Lewis perceived a fighter as like a threat, he didn't fuck
Yeah,
around. Like when
sure.
he thought a fighter might do something, like he was like, I'm taking this person out. And that's kind of like what he did with Galata. You know, Andrew Galata, we know very well the story of Bo Galata in both fights. But you know, despite the kookiness of all that shit, Andrew Galata overall still looked as a fighter really good in both of those fights. He beat Bo's ass the majority of those fights. There were a couple moments in both fights where Bo was getting his too, but that being said, you know, Galata was a threat to the heavyweight division on those nights. And so a lot of people just there was a big to do before that fight. Lennox, what are you gonna do if he starts fouling you? Type of shit. And Lex was like, I'm gonna whoop his ass. I don't give a shit. I'm gonna, you know, there was a big whole thing before that and all that type of stuff. And sure enough, Lennox just came out and just took him out. And I'll never forget the look because this was right around when I was starting to kind of become more of a boxing fan. I'll never forget the look of on Galata's face when he got dropped. And he's
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
like he's like looking like, what the fuck do I do? This guy is just whooping my ass. Yeah, dude, it was pretty funny. And but that was also just a preview of like, oh, like he could do this again. Holy shit, he's taking
Sure.
people out.
And it was awesome to see, you know what I mean? Like, and that was a fun time for Lewis. Like, he knocks out Galata, the Shannon Briggs fight, which I was kind of hoping the Berlanga Canelo fight would kind of end up being like, that meaning that like Berlanga would have came out like Briggs. And you got to give Briggs credit, all right? You know, when like we talked about this, a lot of these current guys that they're trying to be like, hey man, I went the distance and I tried to fight for greatness and I did this. No, you didn't. Like a lot of these guys like Berlanga or Charlo or a lot of these dudes who have fought Canelo recently or other big name fighters who have gone in there like to fight for a championship. Sometimes they just go in there and it looks like they're just happy to be there. You know what I mean? And the fact that they make the distance is that's their win for themselves. They didn't need to get an official win.
And then afterwards,
This is
we're
for the
all warriors. We're all. It's
yeah,
like
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I landed some punches on him. He knows he was in there with a legit fighter. Ah, shut up. All right. I give
you
Shannon Briggs
lost every second of every round. Stop it.
I give Shannon Briggs all the credit in the world. He knew he was being outgunned in that fight. He knew that Lennox was a overall better fighter than him. And Briggs went out there, didn't give a fuck, and still came with the business. All right, like he also too had the criticism from the George Foreman fight on his back because he knew he didn't deserve that decision, but didn't give a shit. He went out there, swung for the fences, hurt Lewis in round one because I think Lewis was surprised that Briggs was coming at him like that, and caught him with some shit. And it was a fun firefight until Lewis finally planted him in like what was it, round five or so. But like,
Yeah,
it was fun. And those were fun fights. I mean, the Maverick fight was meh. But
yeah.
when he ends up fighting Evander Holyfield, that was solidified his reputation as being the absolute best of his division and maybe being the best of his era because that was the fight that everyone wanted for so long, right? Everyone was like, yo, man, we need to get Holyfield Lewis just to settle this shit, just to settle this shit. It needs to happen, it needs to happen. And finally, when it happens at Madison Square Garden, in March of '99, it was like anyone who watched that was just like, I was probably the biggest head scratcher you could possibly ever watch. I mean, still to this day, it might be the worst decision I've ever seen in my life. Like, absolutely no way in hell that Holyfield won that fight. You can smell the corruption out of it. And it was absolutely absurd. But, Lewis, to his credit, Lewis, because, think about this, man. A lot of guys, they can get so disheartened, right, from getting jobbed in that first fight. And it's happened too. Remember, we discussed this with Azuma Nelson and Jeff Fennick. And there's been other times in history where guys like they deserve that first fight so badly that it does something to them. And then the rematch and they're favored to do it, they just get dismantled. But Lewis, to his credit, he came back in the rematch. Holyfield definitely was more motivated and had much more success than he did in the first fight. And it was a closer fight, too. I think that they gave Lewis more of a wide lead because of how bad the first one was. But if you watch it, it was a relatively very close fight. Holyfield, Lewis had to dig deep to make sure he won that because Holyfield came prepared. But after that, it was basically the Lewis era for like the next 4 years.
Lewis had to fight in the rematch. It was
Yeah,
just that the rounds that he did win were rounds that he controlled, like with his jab and shit. And so I
sure.
think that that's kind of what made the difference. But it was definitely a closer fight. Lewis was clearly the winner of the first fight. But I mean, that was also it's weird, especially to acknowledge now, but the Shannon Briggs fight was Lennox Lewis actually capturing the lineal heavyweight
Right.
championship, which I know is again it's weird because people are like Shannon Briggs that's how it goes, dude. The guy who beats the guy who beats the guy, and Shannon Briggs defeated George Foreman. I mean, he didn't actually. We know that, but we can't play that game. We can't play the whole, well, I don't feel that was a win, so I'm going to count it different. Then everybody'd have a different fucking heavyweight champion, all right? So
Yeah.
the point is, Lennox Lewis did capture the lineal heavyweight championship with that victory over Shannon Briggs, but then he also consolidated it, consolidated the actual titles against Vander Holyfield too. And like you said, after that, it was basically the Lennox Lewis era, but unfortunately, Lennox Lewis wound up meeting it against Asim Rahman too.
That's right. You're right. I mean, bro,
Damn, Lennox, you did it twice, bro.
absolutely absurd, bro. Like he beats Michael Grant, and that was a huge win from him too, because Grant was being built up as the next American monster, and him fighting Lewis at MSG was supposed to be a coronation.
Man,
That was a huge fight.
U.S. media got that wrong.
Badly wrong. I had a feeling Lewis would win, but I didn't think he was going to do it the way he did, man. That was awful. And credit to Lewis for showing again why I love him as a heavyweight, because he showed he was levels above guys that, again, like you said, if he deemed someone a threat, or if the public built him to be a threat, and he made it known that he was like, all right, I actually got to like take this shit in. Well, he was going to perform accordingly, and that's what he did with Grant. Knocks out the same thing. He completely trounces David Tua in a one-sided decision, which was not fun to watch. But the Rockman fight, and here's the thing, right? Lewis was always, we talked about this before, Lewis sometimes, if he didn't take an opponent seriously, he could fight down to the level of his competition. And now it's in 2001, he's beaten Holyfield. Tyson is not really around at this moment because he's off doing other things, and he's beaten David Tua and he's beaten Michael Grant. And Ibeabuchi's out of the picture too now, right? So he's like the top of the heap, and you can't really see anybody aside from maybe Chris Bird, who really wasn't gonna be able to compete with him, thinking that like he was gonna have like a logical challenger out there. So when he has to fight Hasim Rahman in South Africa, I mean, think about it this way: Lewis now has been like he's being more and more of a media person, right? Like he's out and about everywhere. He's been filming that movie Ocean's 11 with Klitschko. That was the guy that they were building up to fight on eventually, Vladimir, and that's everything. His mind is everywhere else except that fight, right? And Hasim Rahman, even though he had been a contender and an exciting fighter, I think people, after seeing him lose to Moskayev, and well, he had two losses. What else did he lose to at that point?
David Tua.
But that's right, Tua. Yeah, yeah.
Well, and
Um,
he went life and death with Corey Sanders too.
that's
Like, I
right.
mean, like that
That's
was a
right.
battle.
That was a great fight too. But
Yeah, nobody ever talks about that. That was a battle, bro.
and that was when Sanders was still sporting that mustache back then.
Yeah, yeah, that Super Mario mustache.
All pudgy on the side, but man, what a fucking quick left
Yeah, that
hand
fool
he
came straight from the golf course and just was whooping
had.
people's asses coming straight from
Had
the
his
golf
hands
course.
down, would walk in there with a gut over his thing with the Nashua trunks on. He would walk in it with his hands down, and you're like, "What the hell?" And he was like, one shot, and you just kind of like,
Yeah, it's fast as fuck because you weren't expecting it. You'd be like, "Whoa, that guy's fast."
"Oh my god, man!" I loved it when he devoured Klitschko. That was fucking awesome. But
I remember hearing about it, and then it was on tape delay because it
yeah,
happened in Germany, I think. And then they showed it like 6 hours later, but I already knew it. So I was like, I gotta watch this. I gotta see what happened. And then I'm like, holy shit, he got housed.
absolutely. But Rockman, no one considered Rockman having a chance in that fight. Nobody did, all right? Because, like, why would anybody? You know what I mean? And the fact that Rockman took this very seriously, he knew that if he got blown out in this fight, that there might be another chance he was going to get a shot for a very long time. And to his credit, he was like training diligently. He went to South Africa super early to get acclimated because the altitude is so high up there, right? And it's gonna be hard for you to breathe. And Lewis just didn't. Lewis went out there only like a couple of weeks before the fight, or even if that, wasn't really training, was still hobnobbing and doing this and that, and not getting ready. While Rockman was just in the trenches getting himself together. And the proof is what happened in the fight. You know what I mean? Like you can't. You gotta love that ending of it where like Lewis is clearly struggling, but like he's still skill wise levels above Rockman, but he's like struggling. And then that the ending sequence when Rockman comes in with like those 6 jabs in a row or whatever it was, boom, boom, boom. Like he chased Lewis across the ring with the jabs, remember? Like he just jabbed him, jabbed him, jabbed him, jabbed him, and Lewis like backed up all the way across them. Some of them landed, some of them didn't, but it's still. And Lewis is sitting there smiling about it now. He's like, and as he's smiling, Rockman
Because
comes.
he's doing that kind of two-arm parry, like just picking him off easily, easily. and then another one comes and just boom.
Oh, and then he's smiling, boom, he just drops, and he's just like,
Yeah, he was definitely way more hurt there than he was against McCall.
oh,
And
absolutely. I don't think
dude,
he got up for that.
it was a perfect it was a perfect like just planets aligning against him really. And a lot of people forget how big the David Tua fight was at the time, because David Tua, he had beaten almost everybody else in the division, and was seen as like he was, if anybody, he was the top contender. He was a hard-hitting guy. Lewis had already been hurt and stopped, so people figure, there was money behind David Tua. He had a bigger than promoter, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that with Lennox Lewis, the fact that he defeated David Tua, and if you watch that fight, there were actually 2 or 3 rounds where Tua actually did catch him with some big shots too. It's not like it was a totally bullshit, fight that nobody wants to watch or something. There were a couple rounds where he actually caught some punches. It was just that overall he controlled Tua and just never allowed himself to really get caught up. And so people were pissed off because Lennox Lewis beat him. And I think it was kind of a bit of a letdown for Lewis. Maybe not a letdown, but like a relief. And he kind of just like, he undid his belt after that shit, bro. And that's not to make an excuse, but that's just to say, like, he was like, well, here's a guy that David Tua beat.
Mhm.
Like, what am I supposed to be doing here? Like, all right, I guess we'll just fucking fight this mandatory or whatever it was. And he wound up catching that shit and getting knocked out. But to his credit, just like against Oliver McCall, he avenged the loss, and he avenged it in pretty short order, and he avenged it fucking brutally.
That was a nasty knockout. And you know what? That was Rockman's fault for. I mean, like, listen, I have a feeling Lewis would have beat him in a rematch regardless. But Rockman did himself absolutely no favors being a fucking knucklehead after the fight. First off, dumping Cedric immediately to go sign with Don King, and then bringing on a bunch of lawsuits, obviously, that I was going to bring. You don't need those type of
Yeah,
distractions.
yeah,
And that,
trying to go in a different direction. They
yeah,
tried to not rematch Lewis. A lot of people forget that. Lewis had to take their asses to court like 4 times to fucking get the
oh, they
rematch.
were trying to go strictly to a Tyson fight, and I get it. Tyson was the bigger money back then. That would have been a massive event, but that's what they were. That's what they were trying to do. They were either going to get Mike Tyson or this guy or that guy, or whatever it was going to be. And they were like, "Oh yeah, we don't, you know." And if you watch that documentary from the early 2000s that about boxing promoters, and then they follow Cedric and they follow a couple other people, and you watch in real time how Cedric gets fucked over on the Rockman deal because they were about to sign him to like a multi-contract with HBO and all that, and then they finally find Rockman. He was like, Cedric didn't have the plan that I wanted. And come to find out, the plan was Don just brought his dumbass into his limousine and like showed him, hey, here's $50,000 in cash. Not even like nothing really, but Don knew, like anyone else, if you show people cash right there, you can give it to them. They'll just take it because, yep,
People don't
always does.
fucking understand that shit,
Yeah.
dude. And especially because, it's not your money, you're not in the situation. You flash a large amount of cash at damn near everybody, and especially somebody if they came from a fucking Baltimore, bro. People, you ever seen The Wire? Come on, that's where fucking Rockman's from. You flash cash to that fool, and he was like,
He was like, I'll take it. Fuck it. Cedric never showed me 50K. And well, whatever. But that was that. And then there was the other things too. He got an inflated ego and big in his head because he thought that he beat like the ultimate best part of Lennox. He thought that, he's going through all this bullshit. He's talking a lot of shit. They
oh,
had
and
that
dude, the
stupid
U.S.
storm.
media was on his dick because they
Yeah,
they wanted an American champion so badly.
1,000%. And you have Lennox doing, and then Lennox is there training diligently. And then you have that fucking fiasco that happened on ESPN. Remember
I
that?
remember that. Yeah, where they're all wrestling and shit. Because
And that's
because
the
he
yeah,
started
yeah,
because he started calling him gay. Like
that's
Rockman
right.
started calling him gay. Yeah,
And Lewis gets up and like, Rockman tackles him down or something like that. And like I never perceived Lewis to be a good street fighter because the 2 times he's had skirmishes against the guys he ended up knocking out, they both took him down at the press conference.
yeah.
Like
He got
remember
tackled pretty quick both
yeah,
times.
Rockman took him down pretty quickly. It was about to like take beat him up or whatever. And then
Yeah,
Mike Tyson
Rockman double legged his ass too,
and then Mike Tyson more or less did the same thing to him when they came in there. Like Lewis threw a shot and Tyson just ducked him and like scooped him
and
right
then
there.
bit him on the leg.
But anyways, that was a nasty knockout. I don't know what Rockman was thinking going like that, but Lewis just went
Oh
and
yeah. Well, and he was wearing like the Shants fucking trunks, there was like trunks down to his ankles and shit, so he couldn't even
Yeah,
move. It's like,
yeah. Jesus, so stupid. But the Tyson fight finally happened soon after that, and that was a crazy event in itself. But Lewis solid, you know what though, Lewis, we all knew that Tyson at that point was past it. Like, but I mean, he at that point too, there wasn't any other names that was going to command that type of attention that Lewis was going to get. Plus, not only that, that was the last guy that Lewis needed to beat that he really wanted to beat from his era. Riddick Bowe was far gone at this point. That fight was never going to happen. He had already beaten Holyfield, and everyone else was gone. You know what I mean? Like this was the guy that he needed for himself from his time to say, like, you know what, I'm the best of this era now. I'm the best from my era from that time period. And so when he fought Tyson, that's kind of how it went. And I watched that fight at the Hall of Fame because I was during Hall of Fame weekend, and we all watched it in a big ballroom, and it was pretty cool to see because everyone was just glued to it. You know what I mean? But like that was just an absolute beatdown.
like
The only things that
90% of the room's going, Tyson just needs to land that one. Tyson
that's
just
what,
needs
that's
to.
what a lot of people were thinking that. Come on, Mike, just get
And
him that one.
all the wet socks in the corner are going, he's never gonna land it. Just stop.
Well, and then like the best part of it is watching Emmanuel Stewart lose his fucking mind in the corner like around before it ends up finally ending. And he's just like, yo, why are you playing with this motherfucker? Like, get him out there. He's like, you gotta keep on dilly down and get caught with some dumb shit if you don't like, you know. And honestly, I think he was doing that both ways because one, he realized that Lennox could take him out, and he was like, enough is enough. Just do it. Stop like laying back. And two, he knew, like, he wasn't gonna say it, but he knew how dangerous Mike Tyson could still be, regardless if he was hurt or not. And if Lennox is just sitting there pity patting and playing, there's still more of a chance that Mike could land that one punch. And I don't, he was just like, stop dicking around. Like, just take him out if you can take him out. Like, just don't prolong it longer than it needs to be. And I think that was the only time we ever saw Lennox like really get like remand, like, really leaned out like that by Emmanuel. We've seen him do it plenty of other times with other fighters over the years, but like, that was the one time he really sat down with him. It was like, yo, stop fucking around, get his ass out.
Yeah, he did that shit like every single round with Jermaine Taylor against fucking Corey Spinks, dude. He was like, "What are you doing?" Like every single round.
It got so bad that at the end of it, he didn't even yell anymore. He was just like, when you as a parent, when you're just so disgusted, you don't even have the energy to yell. You're just like, he just walked away. He was like, bro, he was like, listen, man, he was like, all this bullshit, no, no, no. And then he looks at him so disgustedly. He was like, you got 3 minutes, man. You got to fight.
Yeah, I remember that he's all, "You got 3 minutes, fight," and just
Yeah, he's like, you
walks
got to fight,
away.
man. He just walks away so disgusted.
A
No
lot of
passion.
people thought Jermaine Taylor lost that fight, dude.
Yeah, absolutely. He got a household in him, man. Like he was so disgusted. He didn't even raise his voice. He was just like, I fucking hate you. You got 3 minutes. You got
Yeah, I'm
to
done with you after this. Give
fight.
it about three
Yeah,
minutes. Get the fuck out of here.
you got to fucking fight.
Fuck.
But that Klitschko fight, though, man. I guess to finish this up, that Klitschko fight at the end, though, you know, that really helped Lennox, I guess, solidify his standings too with everything, considering how Klitschko went. But like, that fight wasn't even supposed to happen. That was another one too. That fucking Kirk Johnson initially was supposed to get that gig, and Klitschko was supposed to fight Cedric Boswell. Remember that name?
Horse. Yeah,
Yeah,
bald headed, fucking handle, goatee. Cedric Boz.
muscle
Yeah,
muscle bound dude from that time. Yeah, Klitschko was supposed to fight him on the undercard,
looked
and
the part, just wasn't that guy.
not at all. And Klitschko probably would have knocked his ass out in a round or two in that fight. But anyways, Kirk Johnson, perpetual underachiever, pulled out for injury or whatever happened, and Klitschko got that assignment. So, were you covering fights at that point? Were you there?
Oh no, I wasn't there. That was been like a couple months before I covered my first fight.
Oh, all right. Yeah, it was in 2003, so I didn't know if you were like on the beat or not back then.
Yeah,
But
like late 2003 is when I started.
so when Klitschko got pulled in as the opponent, were you hyped about it, or were you just kind of like, eh?
Well, dude, I remember there was still a lot of there was still a lot of doubt about the Klitschko's at that point.
Yeah.
Because I mean, like they had each suffered like a weird loss, and like the Ross Purity fight for Vladimir, where people were like, Ross Purity, you lost to him? What? And so people didn't really know what to make of that. And then Vitaly Klitschko, I mean, now of course we know in hindsight he almost lost his arm or something. You know what I mean? Like he had like a really bad injury. So it wasn't like he just like, my arm hurts. I don't even want to go. Like he got fucked up. Like, and he was out for a bit after that. But like but it was still weird, especially at the time. People were like, he quit against Chris Bird? Like it
Yeah.
just, people were just like, what? It didn't really make sense. And so like a lot of people were, and also on top of that, this was before Vladimir Klitschko, uh, God, now I'm gonna have to double check to make sure it was before he lost to fucking Corey Sanders. But regardless of whether it was or not, the feeling I remember was still that like Vladimir Klitschko was probably the better brother at the time.
Yeah.
Nah, I guess this would have been in fucking March of 2003, couple months before. Anyway, doesn't really matter. But I wasn't hyped because I was kind of just like, wow, that's weird. More than anything, I think that the fact that it was last minute was
Yeah.
what was kind of like, oh, like they came up with a damn good fight for a last minute fight. Like I didn't think that that's what they would do with it. It was like 3 or 4 weeks notice, which is
Sure.
for a fight of
I
that
don't think they would
magnitude,
do that
massive.
today. I feel like, it's crazy to think because 2003 in our minds hasn't really been that long ago, but it has. It's been 21 years ago. And yeah, I graduated college. I graduated high school 21 years ago. But I don't think a fight like that would get made that quickly today. I don't know. Like maybe it would. Like in terms of just boom, let's just take those two and do it because like I almost feel like in this day and age, they'd almost feel like they can just, build it up a little bit more or something. They'd be like, let's just postpone it and then like try to do something else. I have no idea. But the fight ends up happening. And again, it kind of blows everyone's mind because Lewis, I mean, obviously he wasn't training for fucking Klitschko. He was training for a much shorter Kirk Johnson in a different fight. And he comes in against a guy that's his height, if not even taller than he was, with the same like wingspan. And knows how to fight. Like, I mean, Klitschko was putting it on his ass early on with that weird, gangly, quirky style that he does. He just, you know, but landing. And Lewis is just kind of like, what the fuck, man? Like, how am I, like, how am I gonna deal with this shit? Because he hadn't fought anyone with that type of like height and anything since like, Maverick almost,
Yeah,
and
Maverick, he looked pretty good in spots in that fight too. It's just that I think that he was already like 38 or something like that. He was
yeah,
undefeated, but like 38 or something.
and he was like levels below a guy like
Yeah.
Klitschko when it comes down to it. You know what I
But
mean? But
but yeah, in terms of height and reach and stuff, yeah, dude, it was weird.
and that was what like it was like 6 years after that, like 6 years before that. So it had been a while. And if you watch, like Lewis struggles, but I mean to his credit too. It wasn't like it's almost gotten over the years that everyone's like Klitschko was just beating his ass, and then Lewis ends up stopping him near the end because of a cut. You can't do you act like Lewis didn't end up, making those cuts on his face.
Yeah, they
Like
didn't happen out of nowhere, bro. They
absolutely.
happened as he was starting to put it on him.
Sure. And I got to give Lewis credit because he was eating some bombs. A lot of guys that went down from the same bombs that Klitschko would put on him, soon after that. Lewis ate them. And he took them and landed his own shots back. And that, to Klitschko's credit, took because what that nasty uppercut that Lennox landed, right? I forgot whatever round it was. It was probably the round that the fight ended up getting stopped in or like the next round over or whatever it was. But like, it's just one of those boom. And you see Klitschko's head snap up and you see the blood just go everywhere. And I'm sure the first 3 rows of fucking Staples Center just got absolutely drenched on that shit. But it was like, oh my God, man. It sounded like a thunderclap right there. It was just, like nasty. And it has to get stopped. I mean, like Lewis at this point, like he was starting to take over a little
He
bit.
had
I was
three separate wounds on his face where each one could have led to a stoppage, and they were all just getting worse.
yeah. And it was only what, round 6 when it ended?
Jesus Christ. Yeah.
So imagine like the facial damage he would have incurred had they not stopped it. It would have been permanent. They had to stop it. And then it gets that dramatic look at the end of it where you see Klitschko like chase, no, 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 blood streaming down while he's still trying to chase Lennox and all that, like trying to stop it. They're like, bro, calm down, it's over. Your eyes falling out, like
Oh my
literally.
God, dude. Yeah. That
And
that was really the only time that I remember seeing Lennox that I can think of where like he got that look on his face, and I want to say it was at the end of the third or the fourth round, but it was a round where like Vitali was kind of putting it on him, and Lennox right at the end of the round, right when the bell rings, it's like he puts his head down and he just goes like just starts fucking like mashing at him, and like with the attitude where it's like I don't even care what comes back at me. I'm just fucking throwing at this guy right now because he's pissing me off. And I don't even ever remember Lennox doing that against like anybody. Part of it was he had to, but the other part of it was that he was digging in. He was just like, fuck it. Like, we're here, let's go. And I think that, like you said, that bought him a lot of fucking goodwill. Like where a lot of people were, Lenny's had a shitty career. He's fucking boring. Nobody likes him. He's blah blah blah, not entertaining. And then people were like, oh, he could do that. But the problem was that now they got a taste and they wanted the rematch. They wanted him to fight so and so. They wanted to fight. And it's like, bro, he's like 39 or something, you know?
And he
Like,
bowed out perfectly. I think he knew at this point that time wasn't going to be on his side. He didn't want to put his body through the same shit that that everyone else was going through, and it just wasn't worth it. You know what I mean? And to his credit, he stood retired. I know there's been times, many a times, where there's been lucrative opportunities for him to come back, and he's discussed it. And like he's almost made like cryptic comments in thinking that like he might come back one day because of whatever it is. But nah, he sat there, he's gone gray, and he just does this. He's gone gray and became a hilarious analyst for a little while on HBO.
it's
During
over. It's over.
Bro, you could hear how happy was the gleam in his voice because still hates Rockman. Rockman is out on his feet. It's going over. He cannot tell. It is over. And if you listen closely, Jim Lampley still won't give him his shine. You still hear him yapping under him. Ah, there you go. Like, he
He had to have the last word.
always had to do that, even though another guy like it was rare when the color commentator, the expert analyst or whatever would get like super duper excited. A guy like Emmanuel Stewart or Lennox or any of those guys. And when they do, like when Emmanuel Stewart got excited during fucking Tony against Giroff in the last round, and he's going over there, just let Emmanuel Stewart have that moment. He was calling it perfectly. Instead, you hear him, oh yeah, Rockman's still hurt. Oh yeah, he goes down too. Like, shut up and let him say it. That was perfect the way it is. And Lennox just rambling on was fucking hilarious. And having you lower your voice a little bit lower, just shut up. Anyways, he
Yeah,
never had
dude.
to come back. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, Grisham does that shit now, and I can't handle it because he just is like
Uh,
barking over everybody, and or no, not Grisham. Sorry, fucking Morrow. Well, Grisham too, for that
Mamma
matter. I can't
Mia!
stand Todd
Yeah.
Grisham either. But yeah, Morrow's just like God, dude. He sounds like a nightmare to call a fight with. Anyway, 100% though, because Lennox was trying to get in on that action. Just let him take away with it, bro. He's got a personal investment in this.
Totally. And, ever since Lennox retired, I mean, there have been British heavyweights that have gone on the scene since then. Like there's been David Hay and most notably Tyson. Hmm?
I was going to say, technically, Andy Ruiz got in on this with Anthony Joshua, although it wasn't, wasn't fully, but and that was also a last minute. But so that's kind of the answer to what you were saying. Like, would that happen nowadays? I mean, it kind of did, but Andy Ruiz was not brought in to win. Like, that was not brought in to be a competitive fight.
Absolutely fucking not. And you had Tyson Fury, who obviously came in over the years, and like you said, Anthony Joshua and Joshua, and there was a few flops as well too. Remember, Audley Harrison was supposed to be the guy that was gonna like take over the heavyweight
Oh my
division.
god, man, he was bad.
He wasn't even that bad of a fighter. Like, he was good enough to win a gold medalist, albeit it probably wasn't the best of the eras for
Yeah,
the
in the
Brit.
pros, he was. Ugh.
Yeah, fell apart. David Price was another one. Um,
Oh, poor David Price, man.
Good fighter. You know what I mean? I couldn't get over that hump, and well, anytime he stepped up, he got fucking annihilated badly. But
The very least, he gave us that great sound clip from Homeboy after the fight. What I'm gonna go home and break my
yes,
wife's hip.
I'm gonna break the business. He was like, I've had sex in so long, I'm gonna break her. And everyone's like, everyone on fucking early days of boxing Twitter all messaging each other. Anyone checking on Mrs. Thompson? But
Oh man.
no, I mean, this has been a fun discussion talking about this throughout history. I'm pretty sure we covered as fucking thoroughly as we could of
We
every like,
literally started at James Fig.
yeah,
I mean, we went from James Fig to fucking Tyson Fury. So I think we're all right. I think we covered about as much as we could,
sure.
unless we wanted to make it a much longer show.
I'm cool
No,
on
dude, it was
that.
fun. No, I hope the fight this weekend's good. That's above all. I hope it's entertaining. I hope it's fulfilling. But it's always a lot
And
of
I hope
fun
it don't
talk.
go the difference, not difference. I hope it don't go the distance, man. I'm not big on these distance fights anymore. I'm trying to get my work in and go out.
Yeah, dude, I'm not trying to have you count these like 9 hour cards, bro. Like this is too much, way too much. And for my buddy's sake, come on, Anthony Joshua or Daniel Dubois, make this shit happen.
Oh,
But
I don't care who wins the fight as long as someone lands a knockout punch within the first 5 rounds.
making an early night for my homie here. But dude, I appreciate, man, because it's a lot of this is just you and I kind of winging it. Some of it's stuff that we already know, but we do have to do some research, some homework. So I appreciate it, man.
Absolutely. Always a blast.
Anybody who caught us, if you listened in, go ahead and subscribe on whichever podcast app that you listen to podcasts on. Leave us a rating, comment. If you're on YouTube and watching that way or listening that way, we appreciate it. Go ahead, subscribe there, comment, etc. As far as social media goes, we're both on there. Find us. I put
Mhm.
the little border on the video, blah, blah, blah. And then Knuckles and Gloves podcast also on Facebook, Instagram, and a couple other places. Go take a look. Eris, talk soon, bro.
Have a good one, y'all.